Hello, everyone. Welcome to Journey Through Reality. Today, I am joined by Ishmael Hodges. Um, do you mind just introducing yourself a little bit for people who either from my audience watching this live and don't know who you are, or are watching this back on YouTube?
Yeah. Um, I'm Ishmael Hodges. I write on Substack. Um, Sort of a generalist. I've had quite a varied experience over my life. I grew up in fundamentalist Christianity. Um, a very, I typically don't say I won't say a cult, but a very sort of cultish um, sect of Christianity. Um, Eventually got out of that and then ended up in some other areas like conspiracy theorism. And so yeah, just sort of been all over the place, and I write about a variety of topics. But I write about philosophy, but I also write some things about religious deconstruction, sort of pulling from my experience of having been in a very what do they call, like a high control space, and having gotten out of it. And so I also do some writing to try to hopefully help other people who maybe also came out of high control religion, um, or maybe to give a bit of insight to other people who kind of don't know uh, what goes on in those types of religions and sort of what the personal consequences are to those who are involved in them. So,
Sweet. Yeah. So we got connected on Substack. I'm not sure exactly when, but
mm,
we have built up a bit of a relationship since then, and we have spoken several times. But each time the conversation has been either hosted by you or it's kind of been like you and I and then someone else. Never before have I interviewed you, but throughout the kind of course of our conversations together, it's become apparent that our, despite the fact that we were both brought up um, Christian, our experiences of what that um, what that was and what that meant were like almost opposites.
mm,
For those who don't know, I was raised Eastern Orthodox. I am no longer Eastern Orthodox. I'm an Anglican nowadays. But my upbringing in Eastern Orthodoxy was fairly kind of like on the liberal side, I guess. But generally, it was a positive experience, and I never had any apart from like being a rebellious teenager or whatever. I never had any like terrible experiences in Christianity. But you, on the other hand, were raised in something that is like entirely foreign to what I understood Christianity um, to be, and so I think throughout the course of our conversations, like when we've spoken about religion, it's potentially been frustrating for both of us at different times because we've
mm,
been a bit like why does the other person not understand that this is um there is X form of Christianity or whatever. And so really I wanted to talk to you to get a better understanding of that, not only for myself, but I also see, I run in theist circles of people who are theologically interested and like theologically literate, basically, and who are interested in having a fairly sophisticated or nuanced understanding of Christianity. Um, and then an atheist will come along and kind of like criticize some part of Christianity, and then there is a tendency in some theological circles to kind of like malign those people and be like, well, they're just attacking a straw man of Christianity. That's not what we actually believe or whatever. But actually, there are some forms of Christianity, which I mean, we may see as a straw man, but actually, like they exist. These are real communities. These are real people who believe these very real things. Um, so yeah, I basically just want to get a bit of a better understanding of that, and in doing so, get a better understanding of fundamentalist Christianity in general. Um, So it might be helpful actually. Do you mind kind of defining what fundamentalism means, or like how you understand it and why you
Mm,
picked that word to describe your upbringing?
yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, fundamentalist was how we described ourselves. Um, I honestly don't, as far as, and I'm American, as I'm sure most people can tell. Um, I'm originally from the North, so I have a long time sort of I don't even know if correcting is the right word, but like even here in the States, if I say that like I came up Baptist, people think like, oh, Southern Baptist, and it's. I'm not going to say that we don't share a lot of very similar beliefs. But much of Southern Baptist, or what you'll hear called Southern Baptist, sort of exists in what you'll hear termed the Bible Belt in the United States, tends to be much more, and this group I'm sure most people are familiar with. They tend to be much more evangelical. Um, and so I think the best way to describe it would be, if you look at like evangelicals and um, sort of like hardcore fundamentalist, because I think with, uh, as with most things, I'm sure it's a bit of a spectrum, you know? It's not like there's always going to be this incredibly crisp divide. And even within sort of fundamentalist Christianity, there's degrees, of sort of, narrowness and restrictiveness, and there are absolutely parts of fundamentalism that are way wackier, quite frankly, um, than how I came up. And there are even some quite wacky evangelical kind of subsects as well. But to sort of draw the distinction, I think it largely comes down to a matter of focus. Um, so the name evangelical, um, is essentially showing that the focus there is them wanting to evangelize. And so if you had to maybe look at a verse for them that sort of motivates much of what they do, it would be like, "Go ye into all the world and preach the gospel, and lo, I am with you always."
Mm.
Um, and for fundamentalists, once again, I'm not trying to say that these things are completely mutually exclusive, but for people that are like self-described fundamentalists, while what we call, I always try to not assume, because there's a lot of terminology, and I don't want to assume that people automatically know what I mean. So in our groups, essentially going to other people and trying to convert them, to get them to convert to Christianity, we called it witnessing, um, which I just take for granted, but actually now that I think about it, is kind of an odd phrase for proselytizing, of saying witness, because witness means like just to view something. Um, and then if you're going to essentially, we would always, so yeah, maybe we can clear up some of the language up front. Um, Within fundamentalism, it was common practice essentially to like tell the story of how you got saved, which in fundamentalism is a specific event, which I've come to very much learn sort of through talking to you, is not something that's really like across the whole of Christianity by any means. Um, so sort of we also would engage in evangelism, but our focus was much more on, I guess you would say, preservationist concerns. Um, and we were incredibly focused on what they called separation. Um, so if we had a sort of driving verse, it would have been something like, "Be in the world, but not of the world." And so when it came to us interacting, even with evangelicals, we were constantly sort of battling against how they did things because, um, people are probably familiar with things. familiar with things like praise and worship music, contemporary Christian music, um, different sorts of like outreach type things that are really common in evangelicalism to essentially try to like lure in um, people to make Christianity seem appealing. Um, our perspective was that all of those things were essentially allowing the church to be contaminated by the world. And so it was a very binary kind of setup where there were those of us who were saved, and then there was the rest of the world who was lost and damned. And anything that had to do with the world was called worldly, essentially. So if you ever hear people in sort of fundamentalist circles use the word worldly, um, it's a bit more because they certainly don't own that word, but it's a bit more sort of a lateral phrase. Then you might hear someone say like, "Oh, we're not worried about worldly concerns," and they're just sort of like counterpointing like everything, like even themselves in the world against like what God is or what God wants.
Yeah, or
And
it's
we,
sometimes used in the context of like material wealth or
yeah.
like like consumerist kind of stuff, and yeah.
Mhm. And I'm not to say that we didn't have that concept, but typically if we said, "Oh, that's worldly," we were talking about behaviors that we didn't approve of, that we felt were dangerous and were like, sort of like a spiritual contaminant, essentially. And so what that looked like in practice, this might be just the easiest way to it is, I can just sort of give some of the bones of my story. I went to Christian school for kindergarten, and then my mother pulled me out of Christian school because she couldn't control what I was being taught.
Right.
Part of what led to this was the fact that I went to the school library and I came home with Where the Wild Things Are. And just the imagery and Where the Wild Things Are, she found to be incredibly troubling, potentially demonic,
Right.
caused a huge stink at the school. And so I was pulled out, and then I was homeschooled from 1st grade all the way through high school. Um, when it came to behaviors, we had a television that it was it we were not ever allowed to watch actual television. Um, we had essentially like a TV with a VCR, and for good portions of the time, that was actually locked up in a closet, essentially. And then there was like a collection of essentially VHS tapes um, that my parents found you know unobjectionable that we were able to watch. There could be no sort of you know nothing over rated G. Um, no sort of language at all. Anything that had any touch of sexuality to it at all was not allowed. Um, I pretty much was not able to like I watched a lot of the old Disney movies, but I was not allowed to watch any pretty much any of the Disney movies from, like, The Little Mermaid forward because there was cleavage, um, car cartoon cleavage.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. So, like, anything that could possibly, like, inspire, lust in my young manly heart. Um, essentially didn't have any friends. I had a sibling, but even in we would actually end up sort of and this is where it can be sort of strange because, like, sometimes the fundamentalist circles, they could be a little bit fragmented, because what it looked like for us a lot was that we would actually sort of church hop a lot because we would end up in a church, and then we would be there for a while, and then there would always be something or some way that the church operated that my parents didn't approve of and was too worldly in some way or another, and then, um, we would leave. And so we would then go try to find some place that was more separated. That was always the term, we were always looking for somewhere that was more separated, but there was always some sort of problem. And so, pretty much, um, even though I was in these churches where there were other kids and stuff, I was never allowed to go over to any of their houses. I was never allowed to participate in any of the, I was never allowed to participate in any of the youth groups. Um, because, if I went over to some other kid's house to hang out or play over, it was almost a certain thing that they would have things they would be doing things I wouldn't be allowed to do, like watching movies, action figures, you know, any number of things like that. Um, and so my social development was almost non-existent, I guess I would say. And so that's just sort of the practical thing of how it sort of played out. But as far as from the more beliefs standpoint, um, the theologically it was a little bit messy because um, it's sort of been. I think it was one of your recent articles you were talking about, the theistic personalism versus, um, uh, God as this more sort of you can tell me the
Like
term.
classical theism,
Yeah, like
basically.
classical theism. And it I I don't know if I mentioned it. I think I mentioned it in my, conversation the other night with yeah, I think if you listen to it with Satanic Fragment, where I said it's speaking with you and engaging with your stuff has actually been really helpful to me, and perhaps an ironic way, because it's like as I'm learning more about, sort of theology, I'm realizing that, like, not only do I not believe what I was raised to believe, but even amongst other theologies, um, sort of the theology I grew up believing was just incoherent, kind of it's trash. Like, it's really kind of trash theology. Um, and I think that maybe to people who are, like, sort of pure theistic personalists or maybe people who are more pure classic theists, ours was sort of this really bizarre combination because when you listed out, like, the things that were sort of believed by those sort of 2 sides, we sort of believed all of it, even though a lot of those things are sort of seem mutually exclusive to each other. So, for example, we believed in, like, all the omnis, of omnipresence, omniscience, like, all these kind of things. Um, but so we believed in all the omnis, and we also believed that God is love. And so, given that we believed in omnipresence and all these kind of things, then we also believed that God was everywhere, but we also believed that God was male, and that to refer to him in any other way was essentially blasphemy, and that he literally had a son, but was also purely spirit. And um yeah, it's so and so much of the faith, like, it would be uncharitable, I guess, to say that that was the entirety of the faith part of it. I think that there were bits, and obviously everyone interacts with these things differently. But so much of the faith in my sect was literally the willingness to just hold all these sort of contradictory things together at once. Like, that sort of was the faith,
Hmm.
was that this doesn't make any sense whatsoever, and your ability to just accept that and keep your mouth shut was a mer was a merit, you know? And that's why, and honestly, I don't think I would really say it anymore. But that's why for years that, like, I essentially would say something to the effect of, like, faith is not a virtue, it's a sometimes necessary evil. And I feel like my views on it have probably changed a bit now, partly from honestly talking to you. Um, but we were expected to, hold all those things in tension. So we were expected to believe that God was pure love, but also that God was righteous and that this empowered him to take violent vengeance whenever he so chose. Um, and then as far as sort of the Calvinism Arminianism thing, as far as, like, are you predestined, or are you, do you work it out through works? Once again, there we had this sort of blended idea where we weren't fully Calvinist because we were sort of bothered by the idea that that would make it where you wouldn't want to sort of that you wouldn't want to preach the gospel to others.
Mm.
But we also believe that God did know everyone who was going to be saved. So we did believe in free will, because the free will thing was very important to us, because in the way that we looked at things, free will was literally like what sort of made us in the image of God, and free will was what distinguished us from the animals,
Right. Yeah.
if you're looking at like the creation story. And of course, also we believe that we were young Earth creationists. We believe that Genesis, we believe evolution was a satanic lie of the devil, and that the Earth is literally 6,000 years old, and God literally created. I mean, pretty much literally everything. Jonah, literally, God made a fish specifically, and we were literalists to the point where we would correct people if they said Jonah and the whale, because it doesn't say whale, it says fish. And so, and if someone said, and once again, it's just an example. If someone said, well, like, there's no fish big enough, and how, and all these kind of things, we would just say, well, it says God prepared a fish. And so God obviously just made a fish that was able to swallow Jonah and swim him, across half the length of the Mediterranean over 3 days. And then we literally had pictures of like the fish essentially beaching himself and like vomiting Jonah out on the beach, and him covered in seaweed and stuff. And and like some of the pictures that we'd have would be like him. It looked like that. It looked like the Monstro scene from Pinocchio or some shit, where it was like inside of this fish with Jonah just sitting in there, like, his clothes all tattered up on like the tongue. You can
Yeah.
see the inside of the fish's ribs and everything. Um, so yeah, just this storm of like biblical literalism, and we considered any attempt to not treat the Bible as literal, and to not treat it as every single bit of it having been directly come from the mouth of God, directly inspired word of God. We considered any attempt to soften that, or to make make that not to be taken literally. We saw that as the work of the devil, and we saw our job being to preserve the faith.
Mm.
And I've since learned that this is kind of nonsense. Our perspective was that we were preserving the faith as it had been handed down, and truly followed since its origins, and that throughout sort of Christian history, um, there had been endless attempts to essentially destroy God's truth, and we were sort of the chosen people, so to speak, to carry on this truth. And the way that we engaged as far as the Old Testament was like, the idea essentially was that the Jews were God's original chosen people, but they dropped the ball with the whole Jesus thing, so that then sort of got handed over to us. And we believe that like God still had plans for the Jews, but we thought Jewish people were all going to hell. We thought Catholics all going to hell. We thought everyone essentially. Like we didn't typically think that evangelicals were going to hell. And obviously, of course, obviously, we believed in literal hell as well, and eternal conscious torment, all these kind of things. That we'd have whole sermons about it, essentially, just in borderline pornographic detail, discussing, how horrible it was, and all the ways in which it was horrible, trying to scare people essentially into getting saved. And as far as the salvation thing, um, we used John 3:16, and the verses of if thou wilt confess with thy mouth the Lord Jesus Christ, and will believe in thy heart that God has raised him from the dead, thou shalt be saved. Um, so we very much were focused on the confess with thy mouth part. So we firmly believed that it didn't matter what sort of someone's background ideas about God were. We didn't believe that that mattered. We didn't believe that it really mattered how they lived their life. That didn't matter. If there was not a point where they said something, where they literally said something to the effect of, "Dear Jesus, I understand that I'm a sinner, and I accept your sacrifice on the cross as as the only thing that's able to provide me with forgiveness for my sins, and I now commit my life to you." Didn't have to be exactly that, but that was the bones of it. Like essentially, like the sinner's prayer. Like, "Lord, be merciful unto me, a sinner."
Mm.
Um, and also, like I said, but confess. acknowledge and accept the blood sacrifice of Jesus Christ on the cross as atonement for your sins. We believe that if there was not a time, not a moment, when you consciously did that, you would burn forever in hell for eternity. Didn't matter if you went to church, didn't matter you believed in God, didn't matter if you believed Jesus was God's son. If you did not consciously accept his blood sacrifice for your sins, you would burn in hell for eternity. So almost all the rest of Christianity, as far as we're concerned, were doing the work of the devil and didn't really realize it. We had a particular sort of hate boner versus Catholics. So it wasn't just like, oh, they're misguided. We literally thought we referred to the Catholic Church as the whore of Babylon, and
Right.
we would routinely refer to the Pope as the Antichrist.
Yeah.
We saw the Catholic Church as being one of the greatest sources of evil in the world. Um, and even more so than oftentimes even more so than purely secular sources, because it wasn't just that they didn't believe in God. We thought they were engaging in a full blown perversion of every part of the faith.
Yeah.
So that was a lot, I know, but that just to kind of give people an image. And once again, that was my experience. I You could talk to other fundamentalists, and some of what I said, they'll be like, "Wow, we didn't do all that." And then there's fundamentalists that are like Westboro Baptist level and I encountered some of those. See, that was the thing is like my sort of slice was pretty extreme, but I rubbed elbows with people on either side. So like
Mm.
I did rub elbows with people that were a bit looser than us because the numbers I don't think are really that huge in these groups. So you just sort of unavoidably are like rubbing elbows with people that are a bit more lax than you. But
Sure.
like I also went to work at this camp up in Michigan once where like they were way more strict even than like Bob Jones and stuff. Um, and they were the type of so I was there and I was working on like operations staff and on like the weekend we would like go to essentially the church of the people that like ran the place. And I remember like the first time I walked into the church, um all the women are sitting on one side of the auditorium, all the men are sitting on the other side. All the women had their heads covered. Um because they took the whole bit from Paul about women, like, keep your mouth shut and keep your head covered and all that kind of stuff. So it was segregated by gender. And then in short order after that, I found out that this group was actually still arranging marriages between their kids.
Damn.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow.
Um, yeah. So
Um,
there
I-
are there yeah, there are groups on within sort of the fundamentalist umbrella on either side of how I came up. There are ones that are even crazier, and then ones that are a little bit less mild, but that's sort of the broad strokes of it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that paints a really good picture about kind of what fundamentalism means in practice. Um, but you said earlier that you don't really consider what you grew up in a cult.
Hmm.
And I think, although you used the word cult-ish, um, and I think we have some interesting notions of um, what cult means now, because as a technical term, cult just means like a worshipping community.
Mhm.
So you know, in antiquity, Christianity was a cult. Like it was a community of worshippers based around like a particular ritual, a set of ritual practices. But now we kind of associate cults with basically like personality cults,
Mhm.
where it's kind of like centered around one individual. But um, where do you or where do you see the line between religious fundamentalism and like being in a cult, basically? And why don't you think that that was a cult?
I don't think that they're mutually exclusive, um, because within fundamentalism, there are, like, splinter groups that are 100% just full-blown cults.
Mm,
Um, and there are even large sort of family units because what's the one organization? It's like Quiverful, I believe. Um, there's some that are really aggressive with like you are meant to, and then some of this can like cross over into some Christian nationalism stuff where it's like the goal is to like out procreate. The goal is like we're gonna have as many kids as we can, train them up, because we need them to like get out in society and like change society to, um, and I there once again, all this can be kind of soupy because like my parents are still part of it and all that kind of stuff, but they're not Christian nationalists. So it's not a one-to-one type of a thing. It's not like, oh, all fundamentalists are Christian, that like that. That's not necessarily how it is. There are some that absolutely are. Um, but so far as the cult thing, it's kind of hard, honestly. Um, I think I just am cautious because, as you said, depending on what definition of cult you wanna use, you can start to sort of throw that word around to where it sort of loses its impact. Um, so for me, I tend to make the distinction where I don't like to use the word cult unless there is essentially a centralized power structure whose word is law, and that might not even have to be one individual. Um, but the group that I was in, and once again, it's tough to even call it a group because like so much of it was this sort of splintered thing where we had this sort of across the distance relationship with sort of non-local groups that shared our beliefs because we were sort of so small in number that they're typically there in some areas there are, but like typically there weren't enough people that were as extreme as us for there to be like a whole church of that type of person.
Right.
Um,
So kind of
so
like across denominations or like just across parishes or organizations or
definitely not interdenominational. It was essentially pretty much within like Northern Baptist. Um, yeah, as far as my experience of it. So it was just
but
sort
it
of
was more like
fundamentally
was it more like a movement rather than a
yes,
particular
yeah,
organization structure?
yeah. I guess you could say yeah. I guess you could say it like that. And it was also like it also had ties in with sort of the homeschooling movement. And to be clear as well, this was all during the well, as far as when I was a kid, it was during the '90s and up into like the early 2000s. So things I've been out for a good while now. So I'm sure there's a lot of things going on in sort of those communities. Probably a lot of it's the same, quite frankly, but I'm sure there's things that have shifted and things like that. But it is very tangled up. Quite often, it is very tangled up in like the homeschooling movement, sort of the Christian homeschooling movement as such as well. Um, that might be technically more correlative, but, if you're the type of person who thinks that literally, like, I don't want anyone else, teaching my kids anything but me, and so once again, I always try to be careful because, there's nothing wrong in principle with homeschooling, and it's not like all homeschoolers are, you know, whack jobs or something, you know what I mean? So I don't want anyone to think that I'm saying that, but I would say I feel safe saying there's, like, a disproportionate amount of the homeschooling movement that is, like, religious to some kinda way that's leaning towards what I was brought up in. But, I just don't I feel like cult can just sort of get thrown around to the point, like I said, where it just doesn't really mean anything, and I'm always on the I'm always on guard against that because when how I came up definitely was destructive and had a lot of problems for me. Or caused a lot of problems to me and my psyche and all these other kinds of things. But the type of abuse and the degree to which things get out of hand in what I call like an actual cult is so horrible and so insane typically. And once again, you can technically say there's cults that are not that bad, but like it's so ripe for horrible, just hideous kinds of abuse when you have a completely centralized power structure. that no one is allowed to question. And you could argue within my group that we did have that, and it was technically God, but to me, that's a bit of a stretch.
Yeah, yeah, I get what you're saying. And I
I'm
mean,
fine
like,
saying cultish because the dynamics are very similar. Like a lot of the dynamics in terms of a cult
mm,
of like groupthink, a heavy use of shibboleths, like in group out group language, a
yeah,
lot of the stuff about like, oh, if anyone doesn't understand what we're doing, we need to separate from them. It's all very cultish. So I'm
mhm,
fully fine saying that. And psychologically, me sort of eventually accepting that for all practical intents and purposes, I might as well. I pretty sorry, I was pretty much in a cult. Did help me a lot, if that
mhm.
makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Um, because you've probably heard me say numerous times of like, if you came up in a cult or like cult-like religion, and then you get out of it, it is completely normal for you to miss it sometimes.
mhm,
And I had such a huge amount of shame and anger with myself for that for years. And people are probably sick of me giving this anecdote, but I went to an incredibly fundamentalist school, college, um, once I graduated high school and then went to university. Um, and the easiest way for me to sum it up for people is that honestly, it is now decreasing finally, which I'm very grateful for. But up until honestly the last couple years, I've been gone from that place for almost well, now I've been gone from there for over 20 years now. Up until a year or 2 ago, and it still happens now, but not as often, but up until a year ago, at least once a week, if not more, I would have nightmares where I was either trapped inside the school trying to get out, which you might expect, but just as common, if not more common, I was outside of the school desperately trying to get back in, and I couldn't.
yeah. It's interesting you say that because, I mean, I was never like a fundamentalist in the sense that you're describing, but I was certainly kind of in my early 20s what you would call like a traditionalist. And I mean, I left that behind because eventually I saw it was kind of intellectually untenable, and spiritually damaging. Um, Hence why I said earlier that I was Eastern Orthodox and now I'm Anglican. So I have a very liberalized version understanding of religion now, but there are still there are still days where it's like, well, it would just be so much easier if I could go back to that kind of traditionalist mindset.
Yep.
Because it it's like you don't have to do any work. Like you just have all the answers
Mhm.
provided to you on a silver platter, and you know it's correct because it's from God and all this kind of stuff. So, um, but yeah, it's interesting that earlier you said um, that you guys thought you were kind of basically you could trace your theological lineage kind of like directly to kind of apostolic Christianity, and you believe that it had been passed down faithfully throughout all the generations. But fundamentalism as kind of like a modern movement, obviously fundamentalism has kind of like reared its head throughout history in different ways, but
Mm.
um, or that kind of like mindset. But fundamentalism as a movement is contemporary, and was a kind of reactionary movement against kind of liberal Protestant academic institutions, which kind of arose in the early 20th century. And so, do you want to speak a little bit about the kind of historical? Because I don't know anything about like contemporary American Protestantism, essentially. Um, do you want to say a little bit about the historical origins of your movement in particular and how it came to be a thing?
Um, so in terms of, and I've done a little bit of kind of reading since I left. But frankly, for the longest time, I just really have wanted nothing to do with any of it. I just wanted to get clear of it as much as humanly possible. So what I'm about to say there may be little bits of it that maybe are not entirely accurate. So I want to caveat that. So what I'm about to say is essentially what my understanding was um, when I was in as to what was happening. So we didn't we didn't really think that our group as such had existed straight back to um, apostolic Christianity in like a literal sense.
Sure.
We essentially thought so as far as our sort of understanding of Christian history, we more were sort of inspired by certain groups and certain characters. Um, Martin Luther was a big one. So Martin Luther nailing the what was it called to the door?
The 95 Theses.
Yeah, that was a huge deal. Um, he was very much sort of lionized in our circles. There's a it's not a terrible movie, honestly. There's a like an old black and white movie about him. And I remember watching that just over and over again, and this big scene where he's before like the sacred synod, like trying to defend himself, and he's just like I remember the actor was kind of jowly, and he's like up there like you know um like quivering almost with like rage, being like, I cannot and will not recant. Here I stand, I can do no other. And like I thought that was like that sort of like rebellious kind of mentality was like sort of very highly prized. We also placed the Puritans, the Pilgrims, on a very high pedestal.
Mm.
Um, for similar reasons, in that they were another group that um, was essentially rejecting the religious status quo at the time, and they had their more right way of doing things, and so then they braved the cold Atlantic to come here to the U.S. to you know to do things the right way, essentially. Um, and then as far as sort of Baptist history, you know, I, after listening to Bo talk the other day, I've realized that I think a lot of it really, it's like it wasn't actually good history. It's just almost more sort of this like storytelling that happens in these groups, because we were aware of like the Anabaptists, so we kind of claimed lineage back to like the Anabaptists. Um, we were definitely sort of inspired by them. When it came, and so a lot of this is more sort of the Baptist side of it, of why we were fundamental Baptists and not like fundamental something else. Um, so as far as to speak to that, obviously baptism it's in the name. It's a big was a big part of what we consider to be important as well, which was another strange sort of idea, because we thought it was incredibly important, and we found it of vital significance that you did it the right way. So um, we
But
thought the idea,
correct me if I'm wrong. You got the point is that you reject basically infant baptism and that you're like credo Baptist. So you have to be a believer to be
yes,
baptized.
yes,
Yeah.
you can't be baptized without, yeah. So the idea, some churches would do something like they essentially called like dedication. Wasn't actually like confirmation. They would call dedication, where the parents would like bring the baby in, and the pastor would pray, and the kid, they would kind of make like a public showing of like dedicating the kid to God. Um, but there was not any sort of actual ritual or anything that happened. And they considered the idea of infant baptism to be essentially blasphemous. Um, and they also did not approve, because there are some Baptist circles that will do like a pouring of water thing, where they will take
Yeah.
and um and we also thought that that was completely incorrect. We didn't hate that as much. as we did the infant baptism thing, because I remember there being conversations about like, oh, well, there's these like churches in Africa, and they like we could get into that too about how much like sort of just like tacit racism and everything is bound up in a lot of the things they teach. Um, but like, oh, they're in the darkest heart of Africa, and it's super hot there, so they can't get access to a river. So is it okay if it, like just dumb shit like that? And I'd be like, well, if you really have to, you can pour water, but it's really not how you should do it. So for us baptism involved submersion. You had to be submerged. Um,
And did you guys do
and,
triple immersion, or was it just the once?
no, it's three. Yeah, it
Yeah.
was three to represent the 3 days that Jesus spent.
Oh,
Uh,
not the Trinity. Not. So did you do the whole like in
uh,
Jesus' name, or did you do Father, Son, Holy Spirit?
we did Father, Son, and Holy Ghost.
Okay, yeah, sure,
Yeah. Um,
yeah,
and typically, the Holy Spirit was used. I think I heard Holy Ghost used more
yeah. It's more the
than Holy
Anglican, yeah,
Spirit.
the Anglicized version,
Yeah.
yeah. It means the same
Um,
thing, yeah.
which is sort of an interesting linguistic thing on its own, but like that's a separate topic. But like in the churches that I spent time in growing up, the ones that were big enough to do so, it was very common for them to either in the church basement or the main church I was in, literally on the and this isn't super uncommon, literally like on the main stage, like the pulpit and like the floor all around the pulpit was removable. And so they
Sure.
would take that whole thing out, and there was essentially like a baptismal, you know, thing in there. Um, and I think they would hold baptism services like typically once every few months. Um, and we didn't believe that you needed to be baptized in order to be saved. But once you got saved, it was very, very strongly pushed on people that, okay, you're saved now, you need to be publicly baptized. Like, and as far as I guess, as far as like a sort of a practical thing, it wasn't that they wouldn't be like nice to people or anything like that if they weren't baptized, but you really weren't from like kind of a social standpoint. You really weren't considered like really part of the. You weren't really part of the enterprise. You know what I mean?
So
You were sort of new
what
in
did you
faith
guys,
until you got baptized.
yeah. So what do you guys think baptism does? Because it doesn't sound like you guys had a notion of baptismal regeneration.
Not really. It was mostly just it was really symbolic.
Right.
Like it wasn't. We didn't think we didn't we didn't think there was like something like like we very strongly believe that when someone got saved and said the sinner's prayer, like there was something that happened
Hmm.
when you did that. Now you're going to heaven. Um, when people got baptized, it was more like a celebration and a sign of commitment. Um, and sort of you like kind of I guess like ritualistically aligning yourself with Christ's sacrifice. But we didn't think there was like something like happening to you per
Okay.
se.
Interesting. So
If that
your
makes
guys' movement was a part of the Baptist. And when did? Because again, I don't know much about American Protestantism. Like, when did the Baptists arise as a movement? If you know.
as a broad movement, I don't know exactly. I know that just Baptists in general have been. I don't know exactly. I'd have to look it up. Guessing it's a couple hundred years because I mean, like I said, you had the Anabaptists. As far as when that sort of they became their own thing, I don't know exactly when it started.
Hmm.
Um, as far as sort of my sect or like sort of our like kind of Northern Baptist non-event like consciously non-evangelical type of thing. Um, a lot of the I was talking about the homeschooling thing. Like a lot of our sort of movement was very tied up with these sort of third party organizations of different types. And so Um, I think a lot of people are familiar with like James Dobson and like the focus on the family movement. Um, there was some overlap with that. Um, there was a lot of it was tangled up, quite honestly, with a lot of these sort of fundamental style Christian schools. So our organization, our type of Christianity, very much had this one hand washes the other relationship with a lot of these sort of fundamentalist style schools like Bob Jones University, um, Pensacola, Pensacola Christian College. Um, there are a few others. Most of them are smaller. We didn't really have anything to do with Christian schools that we thought were too liberal, like Liberty. If some people are like Jerry Falwell's group, we wanted nothing to do with them. Um, So there were just several large sort of fundamental Baptist style Christian schools that all of our sort of movement would kind of serve as feeders for. Um, and our sort of identity in a lot of ways was somewhat kind of bound up with some of those organizations. Like I knew some people in our sort of broader movement that would go to like Pensacola Christian College. Much of my actual um elementary and um, high school education was actually done using curriculum that was provided by either Bob Jones or Pensacola Christian. Um, but most of the sort of group that I was sort of a part of was very tangled up with Bob Jones in particular. Um, and a lot of the enmity that we had was rooted in sort of the history of that school, in this idea that, and once again, this is how I was made to understand it, was that you early on, you had, like, Billy Graham, and you had who was a, you know, a preacher, and then, Bob Jones Sr., who was sort of like a tent preacher, and his you know, we always kinda would joke that, like, each of the successive generations um of the Joneses, it seemed like they each sort of had their, like, their own bone to pick. Um, and if I remember correctly, Bob Jones Sr. was sort of around the era of, like, Prohibition, and so he was very anti-alcohol. One of his most famous quotes was like, "I'm gonna fight alcohol until hell freezes over, and then I'm gonna put on some ice skates and fight it some more." Um, his son, um and this might broach into some things that you actually might know about. Um, his son, Junior, was very good friends with, Ian Paisley.
Okay, I'm not familiar.
Uh, I don't wanna butcher the history there. Ian Paisley, as once again, people can correct me if I'm wrong. Please tell me if I get any of this wrong. Ian Paisley was very, like, wound up in a lot of, like, the troubles
Okay,
in
okay, right, yeah,
and he was the Protestant side of things.
okay.
And there was a lot of I once again, this is all hearsay. I don't know if this is true. Ian Paisley would come over typically once a year at least and would preach at Bob Jones. Um, they would have, like, incredibly heightened security anytime he was around, because he was such a sort of a tinder peg
Mm,
politically over there and also as a religious figure. Um, and so I heard Ian Paisley preach a lot growing up. Um, I still get a weird thing in my head because of his particular accent. He would pronounce faith. He would pronounce it faith. A man without faith is nothing. Yeah. Uh, and he was incredibly hostile in his language when he would speak about Catholics.
right, yeah.
And Bob Jones Jr., I feel, sort of inherited some of that, and he was very, very openly hostile toward Catholicism. Um, and so that seemed to be kind of the bone to pick there. Bob Jones the third's bone to pick very much seemed to be homosexuality. Um, and there's some history there with that where he later went back on it and said that, that it was horrible that he'd said it, but when he was a younger man, he was doing something, I believe, in Washington, D.C., where he essentially said that, like, things would be so much easier if we just did like in the Old Testament and stoned them. Um, so at least in his younger years, I feel like he was much more sort of Phelps-ish. He calmed down a bit as time went on. Um, and to be clear as well, I don't have anything to do with him anymore. But by most people's standards, I think Bob Jones would still be considered quite extreme, but they have definitely softened up a good bit, to my understanding, since the time that I was there. Um, and I won't go into that whole story because just, I don't know, personal kind of disclosure reasons. I don't really want to go into the details, but um, a member of that family actually was one of the most important people in helping me during my time, sort of separating from the whole thing. So,
Mm.
um, our understanding was that there had been sort of a friendship, and once again, I actually do not know. I'm actually curious now. I need to look it up. That there had been sort of a friendship initially between like Bob Sr. and Billy Graham, and that there'd been sort of a split in terms of approach. Um, because during that sort of earlier era, the whole sort of like uh tent evangelist type of thing. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that at all, really. But
Not particularly.
essentially, yeah. So you have preachers and you have pastors who obviously are in charge of churches, but you also have evangelists who are roving preachers who essentially go around and from sort of the church level, like 2 or 3 times a year, we would have a visiting evangelist come in, and typically it would be like some sort of a thing where it was a cause for huge excitement. There would be there would typically be, like, extra music and, and in my type of Baptist thing, food was a big thing. If there was any cardinal sin that they had, it was gluttony. Um, because that was, like, the joke was like, there was a joke that they would tell all the time that, like, "Oh, these there," that, "Oh, there's these kids and they go to class for school, and the teacher tells them, 'Hey, tomorrow we're gonna do show and tell.' And I want each of you to bring in a symbol of your faith and talk about what it symbolizes for your faith. And so in the joke, the next day, little Jimmy comes in. He's like, "Hey, I'm a Catholic, and and this is the symbol of my faith." And he holds up a crucifix. And then another little kid says, "Hey, I'm Jewish," and he holds up a Star of David. And he says, "Well, this is the symbol of my faith." And then Jimmy the Baptist um, stands up very proudly and holds up the symbol of his faith, and he says, "This is a casserole." Like, so, yeah, and then that was a joke that we would always tell because we would have these big, like, gluttonous potluck things all the time. Um, which ironically always was actually one of the first things that really started to bother me at a young age, is because, like, I read the Bible way more than most of the people in the churches that I typically um, attended. Um, and most of the verses in the Bible that speak about, because we were staunchly anti-alcohol. Like when we did communion, we would use grape juice. Um, and they would actually, like, and I'm sure they believed it, but it was complete fucking nonsense. They would say because people rightly so would be like, Why are you doing that?" Because literally, like, Jesus took the wine and you know
Yeah.
said and I was literally told that, like, "Oh no, it wasn't actually alcoholic." Which is just ridiculous because it's like, um, so the thing that very sort of in short order really bothered me was it was like almost every one of these verses talking about not drinking alcohol, or also the other thing that bothered me was most of the verses don't say don't drink. They say like wine is a mocker, strong drink is raging, and whosoever is deceived thereby is not wise. Um, who has wounds and without cause, he who tarries long at the cups. Like these the verses are all really about excess. They're not about should never touch alcohol. They're about like don't be overcome by these things. And almost every
It would be a bit weird if alcohol was completely banned, but yeah, Jesus's first miracle in the Gospels was to turn water
l-
into wine.
literally making and a good wine too,
Good
because
wine.
when they brought it to the master of the feast, because I guess the tradition at that time was, and it makes sense. I mean, if you've ever you know done if you ever done a bit of drinking, it's like, well, if you've got some good booze and some bad booze, well, you lead with the good booze because you're going to be drunk later. You're not
Yeah,
going to know the difference. You're not going to taste shit because if you're tying one on. And so, like, and apparently that's held true back through history because essentially the master of the feast was like, why are you bringing me the best wine now when they'd
yeah.
run out? He's like, where did this come from? So not only was Jesus's coming out party in terms of miracles, literally to make more booze at a party, he made some really
Really good
supply.
stuff, man.
Really, he made some top shelf shit, you know? Um, so yeah, it's just like another place where like kind of it's just completely incoherent. But but yeah, they would never preach about gluttony. And almost every single one of those verses about, beware of alcohol in the Bible is paired with a verse about gluttony.
Yeah, yeah.
They never would preach about it. And like the disproportionate amount of people in that group growing up were like obese, you know. Um And, there were so many things that just, like, slowly chipped away at my confidence in the whole thing over the years, like,
Yeah, so that's
y
that's one thing. What are some other things that made you start to have doubts about the truth of all of this?
um, hypocrisy was always a huge one. Um, and even when I was still sort of drinking the Kool-Aid, that was always my problem with other Christians in the faith was, that they said to believe things that it was very clear by how they behaved that they didn't actually believe. Um But that didn't necessarily kick me away from the fundamentalism thing itself. But as the root of it, um, there's something that I've even said to my parents is that, sort of ironically, they sort of they sort of set the stage for me leaving by what it was they taught me to value. Because growing up, I was always taught um, that essentially the only thing that matters is truth. Like, I was told what the truth was, but the relationship to truth, and it's something I even sort of have to unpick now that can trip me up sometimes. Because I do think truth is valuable, but I do think there's other considerations in life that are like really important as well.
Yeah,
Um, like not long ago, I heard someone use the phrase like naive fixation on truth, and it bounced off. I was like, "What the? That's not a thing. It's not possible." And then I stopped and thought about it. And I was like, "Damn, I think that I'm still like." And speaking about sort of deconstruction, like you can get clear of these things, which is necessary. But oftentimes, when you get clear, you can sort of start to lie to yourself and tell you that, like, oh, I'm over all of it. And then as time goes by, you can start to realize that, like, oh, I don't believe that stuff anymore, but I'm still operating sort of like a fundamentalist, you know? And so for years, like, my relationship to the idea of truth has been fundamentalist. I just disagreed with what I had been taught the truth was, you know? But I still was operating like, okay, truth is this thing out there that has nothing to do with me, that I'm supposed to find, and it doesn't matter who could possibly be hurt in finding it, doesn't matter. So long as I'm seeking the truth, that's the only thing that matters, the only consideration worthwhile. And I now think that's incredibly naive and borderline stupid. Um, Once again, not saying truth doesn't matter, but I think it's a more of a nuanced context. And so that desire for consistency increasingly led me to see that everything that I was being taught was circular, and that eventually grew into a problem that I could not overlook. And the easiest way to describe that would be um, essentially that the Bible is true because it's the Word of God, and it's the Word of God because God says it's the Word of God, and He tells us it's the Word of God in the Bible.
Mm.
And why is the Bible true? Well, the Bible's true because it's the Word of God, and it's that, you know what I mean? Like, it's this thing that eats its own tail. And just with however I'm geared, that's stopped being enough for me. I could not like, there was a ton of other things that went into it, but, like, I could not ultimately get past the fact of just how that just didn't make any sense. Um, for a short time, I finally had someone acknowledge that what I was saying made sense. And they essentially said, "Yeah, that's completely logical what you're saying. You're right. It is circular, but all I can tell you is essentially that if you have faith, it sort of it sort of holds the integrity of the bubble. Like, that's what faith is doing. It's holding the integrity of this bubble."
Mm.
And for a little bit that was okay. And then eventually I just reached the point where I was like, I can't do this. I can't put my whole self behind something that the minute I even step outside of it for a second, the entire thing collapses.
Yeah,
I can't think that this is representative of what reality is when literally any shift of perspective causes the whole thing to fall apart.
yeah, it's funny you say that because obviously we've had very different experiences, but when I was, I guess, deconstructing from traditionalism, like I had a similar experience where
Mhm,
I would raise these questions and it wasn't as simplistic as just like, oh, just have faith or whatever, but
mhm,
um because I think the orthodox view generally tends to be more nuanced than that. Um
yeah,
but the response was always kind of like to double down
mhm,
instead of like change the theory to fit the data. It was like, well, we'll just double down, and the more you double down, like eventually it will kind of like work itself out. Um, and I think, yeah, that kind of approach to things always. I mean, it works for some people, but you just end up you end up distrusting your own like rationality at the end of the day.
well, and that's fundamental to it, you know, and that and, you know, I'm still I think I'm sort of entering a new phase in my, like, deconstruction process because, like, I think I just sort of completely tapped out of every aspect of it for probably over a decade, where I wasn't examining myself and that I just wanted to be clear of all of it.
mm,
Um, but since I'm entering a period now where I'm really coming back to everything, all these things in principle, like religion, human spirituality, human knowledge, you know, all these things just with fresh eyes. Now that I've sort of gotten clear, I feel finally. Um, something I've realized for myself is I still have this tendency to seek approval from authority sources. Like, I'm fundamentally really rebellious in attitude, but that's on an emotional level. I am like I'm like a fucking supplicant, you know? And it's led to
yeah,
this very confusing existence because literally I had no decision power over anything in my life for 20 years. Like, I was allowed to decide what I wanted to study in college, but even that was channeled because like, when I was 8, my parents had me start, like, taking piano lessons and, like, I can still play, I'm really rusty, but, like, and I
sure.
didn't ultimately end up going for piano, I went for voice, for singing, which is partly inspired by what one of my siblings did, but, like, um, I had my entire being was in relationship to authority and whether or not that authority approved of me.
Mm.
Ultimately, that was God. But then when it came to my parents, when it came to pastors, when it came to anyone in authority at college, when I went to college, they were it wasn't anything as intense as, like, them being, like, the vicar of Christ or anything like that, but they were essentially the godly source of authority that had been put over me by God, and so long as they never said anything to me that was obviously against Scripture, anything that they told me to do, I had to do it. Because to rebel against godly authority, godly sources of authority, was to rebel against God. Um, and so the entirety of essentially my formative years as a person, I had no decision making power at all. I never learned to make decisions. I still struggle with it. It's still a big struggle of mine. Like even just
Yeah.
on the simplest things, I want to defer to someone else because quite not because it's like, oh, what I want doesn't matter. I don't even have a want a good portion of the time. Even simple stuff like, oh, what are we going to get for dinner? Oh, what are we going to watch? What are we going to do? I'm instantly deferential to other people. I don't care. What do you guys want? What do you want?
Mm.
Which is incredibly frustrating then if you're with or around other people who don't, you know what I mean, who are
Yeah.
similar,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know. And so I've had to teach myself to just fucking pick something, you know,
Yeah.
like just to pull the lever and make a fucking decision because it's not something I was ever taught to do. It's not something I was allowed to do. You don't make decisions. You do not make decisions.
Yeah.
And I'd like to speak to this. I was a guy. If you think this stuff is bad for me, and I won't speak to it because I didn't personally experience it, but I saw it. You should listen to what happens to the fucking women in these groups. How deeply sexist these
Yeah.
organizations are. It is insane. And I still struggle with that. There's no conscious part of me that views women as being lesser than in terms of my beliefs. But I still catch myself with this, like, reflexive dismissiveness towards women because their entire existence was subservience.
Mm.
Their goal in life was to get married and have kids and to submit to their husband as they submitted to God. And that was drilled into me my entire life. That was what you were looking for in a woman. You were looking for a servile, submissive woman. And thankfully, I now am with the complete opposite of that. It's fantastic.
No, that's good.
um,
Yeah, I mean, that's yeah, I mean, some of that stuff is yeah, that's, I don't even really know what to say to that. There's nothing I can say that will, um, speak to that situation at all. But, like, what if you don't mind sharing, like, what are some of the other ways you've found that kind of being raised in this fundamentalist Christianity has had a lasting impact on you, whether that be positive or negative?
um, just a constant, intense sense of alienation. Um, and that is not that's not entirely just because of the religion, because there are also other factors at play. Um, we'll say neurologically, and I'll leave it at that. That led me to be incredibly alienated, even within my own family.
Mhm.
So, um, none of it was simple or easy for me. I'm not sure if I ever genuinely believed. I lived in a constant state of fear for my mortal soul because, as I said, we weren't strictly Calvinist or Arminian. Um, and so essentially, It's so hard to even describe because it's so sort of intrinsically nonsensical. So my experience of it was if you got saved, you were saved. But then if you started really acting out and behaving in ways which I did multiple like I would go through these periods of rebellion and then would rebel and then I'd get terrified and then I would throw myself back into my faith with absolutely frenetic zeal.
Mm.
And I was smart and I read the Bible. I knew the Bible way better than most of the people in my surroundings. So around when I was 16, I was like an absolute zealot. I would pick fights with like the elders in my church and just smash them using the Bible. Um, and so I would go through these periods. So the way that it sort of would happen is like it was like, okay, if you said the sinner's prayer and you really meant it, then you were saved. So it wasn't like you could lose your salvation. But if you started acting up and all these kind of things and you started drifting, then people would start to draw into question the validity of your salvation experience.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the issue when everything is based on kind of this very subjective
Mhm.
experience, then it it's like, well, if you've done the thing, then you're saved and it doesn't matter what you do. But if you do these bad things, then it's like, obviously you didn't do the thing properly, so you were never saved in the first place. And
Yeah,
it's like, well, then how does anyone know anything? How
kinda
can
dumb.
you yeah, yeah, I mean, it just leaves you in this or it would leave me in constant existential anxiety. I don't know about other
Oh,
people.
yeah, never stop. I got saved, no less than 4 times, and
Yeah.
the first time I got and see, that was the thing too, was the first time I got saved, I was 4.
Right, okay.
Um,
But you can't baptize children.
no, you can get saved though.
Okay,
As
right.
long as they are of the age of reason, which no one has a good definition for in the organization. Essentially, they treat it like that porn definition, like, "Oh, I'll know it when I see it."
Right, okay,
But
right.
but we believed that children that died before the age of reason went to hell.
Well, at least that's
And
consistent.
so
It's
this
horrific, but at
oh,
least
no, they were consistent. They were real consistent.
yeah.
Um, disgustingly consistent. Um, and so because they believed that children, babies and such, that died before accepting Christ went to hell, this led to a massive amount of anxiety for parents. Something would happen to their kids before they reach the age of reason. And so for me, what that interpreted to was at the ripe age of 4, being sat down and told, "Hey, you know, well, Ish, do you do bad things sometimes? Do you make mommy and daddy mad?" Essentially, yeah, yeah, I do. I'm 4.
God.
Well, that's called sin. And sinners, they go to hell. Hell's a bad place and they burn forever. You want to go to hell? No. Like, that sounds terrible. Well, logically so, because, fire sucks. They told me not to put my hand on the stove and I'd done that, So hell sounded like it was 1,000 stoves. So, and so, well, all you have to do is accept Jesus into your heart. You don't have to go there. If you wanna do that, well, duh, of course I fucking wanna do that, you stupid. And so, repeat after me, "Dear Jesus, dear Jesus." You
Yeah.
can you can sense some of my residual anger coming across at
Oh,
how fucking obscene this whole thing is.
I mean,
Um,
and
so then
fair enough,
this
yeah, sorry,
also s no, I'm sorry, this also sets the stage, though, for you to doubt that experience. So this is a common experience for, like, parents, understandably so, because they think that babies in this sect are gonna go to hell, to want to try to get their kids saved as quick as they can.
Yeah.
So this then leads to them telling their kids about hell at a really young age when you barely know what way is up. But then, because of this idea of the age of reason, when you get a bit older, now say you're 10 or 12, which I think was probably around the first time I got re-saved. You're like, "Well, I was so young then. I don't know if I really understood what was going on. Oh, no. What if I didn't? Oh, what if I'm going to hell right now? Oh," you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
And then going back to the evangelist thing, um, Matt Whiteley, man, Matt Whiteley wrote a banger of an article. I think it was 2 articles ago now, maybe 3. And he's in it, he's talking about, like, the praise and worship culture,
Mhm.
and how, like, disconnected and manipulative it is, emotionally manipulative from, like, anything approaching, like, actual worship or, like, an actual, like, numinous experience. And God, he just nailed like, I would highly recommend anyone, like, if you're finding interesting in whatever I'm saying, like, go check out Matt Whiteley on Substack. And, like, he's got a lot of good stuff, but his article that he wrote on that was just nailed it down the line of I never in my time in fundamental Christian because I've had what I would call sort of like really powerful once again, I'm technically an atheist, but like these really, really intense, like what other people probably would call spiritual experiences. I just look at it and be like, okay, I had this experience. It was what it was. It was incredibly compelling. I don't know how to explain it, but it was what it was. Um, I never had anything like that in my time in Christianity. All of my what I would now consider, like, something like a genuine spiritual experience, they all came after I left Christianity. What would happen in the type of, faith I grew up in was I felt nothing most of the time. Um, I would sometimes get sort of emotional feelings. The only times I felt anything approaching sort of spirituality were from music, and it was music itself. Like, I still remember, like, so not spiritual type music. I
Mhm.
remember, I think when I was, like, 8 was the first time I ever got the chance to sit down and listen to a live orchestra play. And I remember just sitting there at, like, 8 with just tears running down my cheeks because I was just so overwhelmed with how beautiful it was. That was, like, the closest thing I think I really had to, like, something like a spiritual experience during that time with all of that. So I would feel nothing. I never felt God's presence once, never. It's just this yawning black void, which would have been one thing, except that I was told there was supposed to be something there. And
Mhm.
if I sensed anything of God's presence, it was just this unseen judge, you know. Um, like Jonathan Edwards, like we would read that shit. Like Jonathan Edwards' message, his sermon, "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God." You know,
Nope.
that was choice for us. You know, um, and so that was my relationship to it. And the only times that I would feel anything would be when there would be these, like, evangelist services or, like, when I would go to, like, a camp, and they would do this and it wasn't praise and worship because we didn't believe in Christian contemporary, um, music, things like that. It wasn't manipulative in the, "Oh, good feels, let's my Lord and Savior," it wasn't that crap. Um, it was much more typically hostile. It was fear and damnation and all these other kind of things. And they would be this shouting sort of message from evangelists, and they all talked the same. They all had this weird twang that was hard to place, where, like, they'd get up there and they'd be like, "Turn in your Bibles to Ephesians chapter 46. In this passage, the Lord tells us to" like, they all had this way of talking. Um and they would whip you up and be talking about sin, and they'd convince you that you had fallen into sin, and then at the end, they'd play music on the organ, and it would be like, "All of you who have felt the hand of the Lord tonight, come down to this altar and pray and ask for the Lord." And it would whip you into this feeling of guilt, and then you would get super nervous and be sitting there sweating, and then you'd, like, go down to the altar and sit down there and pray, and then the people would shake your hand afterwards like, "Oh, yeah, welcome back to the family." And you'd be on this high after that,
Mm.
but typically by the end of the following day, it was just gone.
Yeah, well, if you
And
put if your whole spirituality is basically just emotional manipulation, then there's going to be these weird, like crazy highs and lows, and
Hmm.
everything is going to feel very passing and very transitory, and like shallow and vapid. Like, uh,
And then went back to that alienation thing because I spent all my time feeling. Sorry, I'm almost welling up a little bit. Feeling broken,
yeah,
essentially, because it was like, what's what's wrong with me? Because in retrospect, it very well may have been the case that a ton of the people around me were experiencing the same thing I was,
mm,
but they made all the right noises. And so far as I was concerned, there was something deeply wrong with me because I tried and I tried and I tried and I tried. And like, I still have to catch myself now because when I encounter adversity, honestly, I feel like I'm mostly past it and that it's sort of just a whisper in the back of my head. But for years, up until my middle 30s, the minute I did anything wrong, the minute I encountered any kind of adversity, I would go from okay to, of course, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how hard I try. It's never good enough. Nothing I ever do, nothing I ever try. I'm a failure. Nothing I ever try will ever be good enough.
it's kind of it kind of like instills like self hatred
Oh yes,
and
loathing,
like
loathing.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah. Like I am the dirtiest sinner ever. No one loves me, and all this kind of stuff. Like it's real damaging.
Yes,
Um,
deeply psychological. It's deeply psychologically damaging. Um, and that's where it's difficult, because you know, there are people within these organizations that do experience actual physical abuse. Um, and it depends how you contextualize that as well. Because I got whooped or spankings, all the time. Um, and that's just the culture there. Spare the rod, spoil the child. Um, so depending on your view on that kind of thing, that definitely had its impact on me as well. I had one parent who, if there is a right way to do that kind of thing, um, I would say sort of did it the better way at least, where, they would sit me down and they were very calm. Um, and this was actually my father in this case. They would sit me down and they were very calm. They would typically make sure that I knew what I'd done wrong and then, give me like the requisite amount of licks, essentially. And then the other parent tended to do it in anger, um, and just sort of like cane the shit out of me. Um, so there's people that experience much worse things than that. But even if you don't consider the whatever they call it, corporal punishment or whatever, even if you don't consider that abuse, which that's a whole side conversation, how deeply damaging it is on a psychological level, especially to young people who have no other frame of reference for the world. Because that's the thing. I think even normally for kids, except that quote unquote normal kids, they end up going to school and then they get constant interaction with other adults, with other kids. I think pretty quickly you sort of realize that like, oh, my parents are like, yes, they are like important in my life and they get to tell me what to do and all these things, but they are people amongst other people, you know. And when you came up like I did, essentially parents and God are, for all practical intents and purposes, they might as well be synonymous. Like, I mean, that your parents are flawed human beings technically, but when it really cashes out to everyday reality, they set the standard for what reality is.
mm,
And they are 100% the way that you orient yourself to the world. And unpicking that in the following years is incredibly difficult because it's like not only are you not only, and this has been really recent for me and God has this been a challenge because it was one thing unpicking myself from the organization. But now I'm beginning the process of unpicking myself from things that weren't even the organization itself, but were my individual parents' psychology. And now what I'm realizing was incredibly aberrant, um, very possibly full bore pathological psychology
Mhm.
that I was literally normalized to. This is how the world works. This is what it's supposed to be. And, you know, people are flawed and, uh, I don't I'll leave it at this. I love my parents. Um, but it's been hard. And my parents love me, and when I left, I fully expected to be disowned, and they didn't. And, you know, I'm grateful for that. Um, and it surprised me. Um, and in its own way, that meant a lot to me. But the road to detangling oneself from it, it can take a lifetime.
Mm.
Um, and part of my deconstruction process has sort of been it's not that I've accepted it as like not like, "Oh, I'm doomed to this." It's a possibility, but I've had to accept the possibility that it's just baked into who I am on some level. And you kinda said the positive part. I've grown to appreciate some of the ways in which it did contribute in positive ways to the person that I am. Because not on the from a Christian perspective side of things, but I got a good education, you know? Um, because I wasn't allowed around other kids, I read voraciously
Mhm.
all through my younger years, and I was reading, like I love the classics. I was reading Unabridged, M Moby Dick and Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson, and all the, James Fenimore Cooper, all that stuff when I was, 7, you know, that was all my time I spent was reading, you know? And so on the one hand, I I was not socialized properly at all, and I still deal with that. I still fundamentally don't really understand how other people operate, and it's given me a huge amount of anxiety in my life because I feel much better now. I'm learning more and all these other things. But it was a massive source of anxiety because for the most of my life after leaving, I had no idea what other people how they were working. I had no ability to predict what they were gonna do. I didn't know what was considered acceptable, so I would say things that were not okay. Um, and once again, some of that stuff goes into sort of, my neurology as well. I can't completely blame that on the upbringing, but it certainly didn't help. Um, and so it's one of those things as far as regret, like if I if I were to be in some sort of a proto state, floating outside of myself, some like, I don't believe in souls, but if you were like if I was like a soul floating and choosing, you know, which which route to go down, probably wouldn't have probably wouldn't have picked it. But that doesn't even make sense on a level because it's like I am me now and I am inseparable from all that pain on a level, but also I'm inseparable from all of those things that it's taught me. And going through all that has now, obviously in a perfect world, such things wouldn't exist. But it's put me in a position now, especially because I'm a writer and I'm able to write, and I'm in a I'm here talking to you and doing these kind of things where I feel incredibly grateful. Fuck it, I'll use the word blessed. Um,
Yeah.
that maybe I, in my work or in conversations like these, even if it just means that somebody else who came from something like I did, that they just don't feel so fucking alone. Um, because just the crushing fucking loneliness of it, um, it fucking eats away at you.
Yeah.
And to anybody else out there, not only are you not the only one, as is evidenced by hopefully listening to maybe my story, there's actually resources out there. There's so many people out there that have come out of this kind of thing. And if I had to say something that's sort of newer to me, because I went through my super reactionary phase after leaving, and I dabbled in paganism, Satanism, all these different kinds of things, and I just became essentially an atheist. I would say I'm still technically an atheist, but whether it's spirituality or even religion, um, or just your fucking life in general, there are so many other ways. There's so many things for you to learn. There's so much of a world out there. So many more beautiful ways for you to be able to engage with the world. And just because you found out that you were fucking lied to and manipulated and hurt all through your childhood, it doesn't mean that there's nothing else. It just means that the people that you came up with were wrong. Yeah,
Yeah.
we're here. You know, you're not alone.
Yeah.
And
Well, I think what you're doing is is great, and I think the people who are online, sharing their journeys of deconstruction and that kind of stuff, like I think it's really important. And I think even uh, speaking as a Christian, I think one of the things that is so valuable about the way you approach things and the way other people in the space kind of approach things is that this kind of stuff needs to be called out. Like, I might not think any of this stuff is inherent to what Christianity is, but nonetheless, like, it's it's fucking awful. Like, it needs to be called out, and we need to say, like, this is not okay. Regardless of your views on Christianity more broadly, and whether you think it's I guess redeemable or whatever, or useful, or as a religion, because I mean, obviously, I think it has massive value in my life, but I can see why someone who has gone through what you have gone through, you know, it, it's not, it wouldn't necessarily be helpful, at least not at this point in your life.
no, definitely not. I don't think Christianity per se, and we won't have to go into that. You and I and the rest of the, kind of the guys, we talk a lot. You've sort of seen how I'm sort of moving around this, what you would call God idea. And like, I'm at this point where I almost, as my other interests, is I'm learning more about like just the conversation on, I've been listening to a lot of theories of everything. Like, I find this sort of very binary, like theistic, atheistic. Like I find this framing almost like tedious at this point.
Oh, yeah, me too.
You
Like,
know,
part of
it
what I'm really trying to do is kind of like show how you can have a middle
mhm.
way.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like, and I won't, and I'm not, and that's the thing is like talking about how like it's just sort of what it is. You know, I totally understand where whatever, if you're talking from a more, a classical theist idea or, this more sort of God is being immanent and pervasive of everything, like this type of a thing, not this angry dickhead. Um, like if you're viewing this more sort of immanent, God, if that would be the way to say it. Um, I totally understand where some people, without my history, where they're like, man, this thing is just like say it's ineffable, and like we have this word for this ineffable thing, and it's God. And I don't have any issue with that. I do not care. Like that's fine. I don't get all wrapped around the axle about that. Like you're free to use that word. I'm
Mm,
kind of libertarian on that front. I'm like, I don't give a fuck. Like whatever works for you, that's totally fine. Um, I just don't. I'm just kind of okay. Like just sort of thinking about the concept. I feel like the word God has just sort of been tainted for me, you know? And I think if I had to say something to the more like kind of classical theist types, it doesn't mean that you have to tolerate if some atheist comes along and is like knowingly straw manning your position. That's not what I'm saying. But um hopefully this has shown that like at least that it will maybe be understandable to more um kind of kind of civilized theologian types why for many of us, when we hear the word God, it's almost like just an instant reaction. Our hackles go up, you know,
mhm.
because for our like quote unquote lived experience, like we've been deeply hurt by this thing, you know. And it's something I'm trying to get away from because like so much of what I've seen in sort of the people like myself is and I've heard it, it irritates the shit out of me, but, like, I do hear theists sometimes sort of say this in a very smug way, and I fucking hate smugness, and so it's, like, really insufferable. But there is something of a point to the fact of, like, when you hear a lot of us atheists sort of talk about the God idea, it still comes across really personal. Like, we're really angry at this character who we say we don't believe in. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
And that's understandable, and I'll still say it, like because, encountering and once again, for me, these are all, like, useful frameworks in which to think about things. I no longer view almost any of this stuff, whether it's metaphysics or any of these kind of conversations, as, like, "Here is what is the case," going back to what I talked about with, like, my relationship with truth. Like, I view this sort of the search and me and, like, all everything as being sort of bound up in this whole thing. So the idea that, like, here's me and here's truth, and I have to find out what this is and have an opinion about it, I no longer think of it in those terms. So whether that makes me start to sound more like a Platonist or I don't really care what it makes me sound like. This is just what how I'm currently thinking about things. Um, I don't want to while I'm trying to embrace that way of viewing at things, I'm also still fully okay with, like, having an attitude strong attitude toward the what I see as, like, the bad version, and for me, since I'm, like, a generalist, I just see this sort of pattern emerging in all these different spaces, that I encounter. So, like, I learned about Gnostic belief and Gnostic conceptions of things, and this idea of like the demiurge. Um, essentially in very broad strokes that like sort of like that there is God. There is God that is this, you know, and that God can really only sort of be like known through direct access, through gnosis. And that sort of the Old Testament idea of God was this sort of imposter force that came in and like took credit for all of creation and did what in my context growing up was like almost like a very Luciferian move
yeah,
was
yeah.
where you, like you had early early man, and it's and then also in my time in conspiracy theory circles, like even in those, I haven't talked about any of that in forever, but you have sort of this ancient aliens thing, and you've got like Zechariah Sitchin and the Anunnaki and like all this kind of stuff. And even in that storytelling, you had this like, oh, this Sumerian tale that you had like Anu, who was like the leader of the Anunnaki, and then one of his sons was Enki, who is associated with the character of the serpent in the Garden of Eden. And contrary to how I was raised to view the serpent character, the serpent character, the idea is that Enki actually took pity on humanity and essentially was like, "Hey, you know," and because the idea there being that the Sumerian story actually is informative, obviously, of the later the Christian Genesis story. It had, it sort of came from it. Because you
But
had
then
what
you know
the
some of the
Ballad of
Gnostics,
Utnapishtim, and yeah,
yeah, and then some of the Gnostics identify the serpent in the garden as Jesus Christ.
yes,
Yeah.
the serpent as being because not to go down the whole side thing, but like I still have a very I still kind of view it honestly. Honestly, I kind of view it through that lens. I view the serpent in the garden as being a good character because I admit that this is looking at what's said there through a kind of a literal story lens. But as far as I'm concerned, God lied right in the first chapter because he says to them because we had all these we had all this dodging and weaving that we would do to make it why God didn't directly mean what he said he meant. Same as they do with the God's image thing, where he says, "Let us make man in our image." And I'm like, "Well, what? Like, well, what are chimps then? Are they in the image of God's idiot cousin Steve?" You know? Um, and then but then the Christians of that type will come in with their knee-jerk responses like, idiot, it means in his spiritual image." I'm like, "All right, I'll sit here and while you tell me what spiritual image means," and like,
Yeah.
um, but, he says, well, first of all, he says, "Let us make man in our own image." Because Elohim, to my understanding, is a plural term. And of course, in my Christianity, they're like, "Oh, well, it's a Trinity." I'm like, that the idea of the Trinity wasn't even around at that time. That was came way later. So, of course, they have no explanation for why that's used as a plural. Um, and of course, it seems that it was actually like a collection of gods that were being described. But anyway, says, "Let us make man in our own image." But when it comes to the tree of the garden of good and evil, God says to Adam and Eve, he says, "You may eat of every tree in the garden except for that tree, because on the day, let's take the words at the face value as all of us read them, on the day, yeah, that thou eatest of them, thou shalt surely die." And then the serpent says, comes along, and we always portray him as he's this liar. He's come slithering along to Eve. And he says, "Ooh, hath God said?" But it's like, okay, take that stink off of it. He comes along and he says, "Did God tell you you're gonna die if you eat that?" And Eve says, "Oh yeah." He said, "The day you eat thereof, you will surely die." And the serpent says, "No, you won't." He says,
Yeah.
he doesn't want you to eat that because if you eat it, you'll be like him. Your eyes will be opened and you'll be as gods. He doesn't want that. So eat it. Eat it. He's lying to you. Go eat the tree. So he goes and eats it. And she doesn't die, and the scales from her fall from her eyes, and she achieves, like, expanded awareness. And then Adam does the same thing. He doesn't die either. And then God comes along, and then there's the idea of this introduction of shame because they become aware of their and God says, "Why are you hiding from me?" And they say, "Well, we're naked. We don't wanna come out." He said, "Who told you you were naked? Who told you you're naked?"
Yeah.
And then he says, "Oh, did you eat the tree?" And he boots them out of the garden, forevermore, and sets the angel with a fiery sword at the gate to make sure they never get back in. Because even within the story, the worst case scenario for God would have been that they would eat, or sorry, the tree of the God knowledge of good and evil. I've been messing it up. That they would eat the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, but then that they would also eat the tree of life. Couldn't have both of those happening at the same time.
Yeah.
So to me, that lines up very much with this sort of demiurge idea of just of that the Old Testament character. We had all of these ways, and it's still present in Christianity of being like, why does God seem to be, and this might offend Christians that are listening to this, but it's like, why does God seem to be this angry dickhead in the Old Testament? with all these really strong opinions about all this minutia, like, oh, don't wear mixed thread garments on a fucking Tuesday or whatever. Like all this really random shit. Like, why is he like that? And then he sends his son, and then Jesus is like, "Oh, well, I don't care about any of that. You know, and we're not under the law anymore. We're under grace." And this idea of grace, and that we're no longer being judged by this law. And it's not settled in Christianity because to this day you've got dispensationalists and covenant theologists fighting each other.
Yeah,
And
well,
it's all this theorizing over why God suddenly calmed the fuck down after he had a kid.
yeah, it's interesting. The relationship between the Old and the New Testament is one of those things in Christianity that is, if you kind of accept the mainstream narratives about it, it doesn't kind of make sense however you look at it. Even more nuanced, sophisticated versions of it. Because like in kind of the Orthodox Church, I was taught that basically, because Christ says that the law isn't abolished, it's fulfilled, right? So it's kind of like, well, what does that mean? What's the relationship between the old and new law? And the idea is that basically the that's true, but kind of the law takes on like a different meaning or context within the context of Christ. And there's also this idea that like Jewish Christians continue being Jewish Christians, whereas everyone else is a Gentile Christian. And so then they point to examples in like Leviticus where there's different laws for people who are outside of Israel and inside of Israel. Um, and so even this kind of like more nuanced theory, which works in some ways, um, it faces difficulty in others. So there's obviously there's levels of continuity, but then there's big discontinuity between the Old and the New Testament. And also, as you say, it seems that I wouldn't go to so far as like, but I think it can be overstated the extent to which God appears to be a bit of like a monster in the Old Testament. Um, I think like rhetorically, it can be a quite powerful thing to say that the Old Testament God is like this completely different character. I think it could definitely be overstated, but nonetheless, I would completely agree with you that there seems to be this progression in understanding of
Mm.
who God is and the kind of character of God, and kind of early ideas being much more similar to basically a pagan God, and then you've got like the divine council and this kind of stuff, and then you start to get, as Judaism becomes Hellenized, then you start to get kind of more philosophical notions of God, and then you've got the kind of two powers in heaven stuff, and that's the beginning of the
Mm.
Trinity, and so all of these things slowly develop over time.
Hmm. And that's all
Um,
very interesting, to be clear. And also to be clear, I don't believe in the demiurge. That, you know what I mean? I just I find
but it's
all
an interesting
all the
mythology to kind of
yeah,
like
all of the
reframe it.
storytelling about all of this is very fascinating. You know,
Yeah, yeah,
um,
yeah.
including,
And
like you said, with the early stuff in the Council of Heaven, and like sort of where looking at something like like the history of Yahweh. Like
mm,
sort of where did that start? I mean, it's not like he just showed up when you have like to my knowledge, like Abraham, and even Abraham, you do have that connection because Abram, who then became Abraham. But like Abram, like he's from the city of Ur, and Ur was one of the main cultural centers in Sumer. You know,
yeah.
so
Yeah.
it's not like, and that's my thing, is because I'm fascinated with history and anthropology, that kind of stuff. It's like it's not even like the story of this way of thinking like began then,
Mhm.
in terms of the themes and some of the characters, and like so much of it. I mean, you're going back to the earliest stuff,
Yeah.
and like I said, when you're looking at some of the stuff about Noah, like and I believe it. People can correct me because I'm not super in this space anymore. But like you have, I think it's like the Sumerian, like the ballad. It's like the ballad of Utnapishtim, I believe, which I think like you see these threads, you know, and to me, it's just a much more fascinating sort of overarching narrative of like trying to understand, even if it is just purely a human thing, like what in like an archetypical sense, in a storytelling sense, like what's the value? What are the messages in these stories that people at the time found value in and wanted to hand on to their kids? And a lot of it can even be very beautiful, you know. Like I'm not one to say that like, oh, everything in the Old Testament is, got like no, there's a lot of amazing stuff in there because from my perspective, it's because it's humans. We're messy. We do horrible things to each other
Hmm.
for horrible reasons, but we also do amazing, beautiful things, you know? Like, it's not like that suddenly is gonna stop when you look at the Bible in either direction. It's not like suddenly everything in that happened in the Old Testament is good, but it's also not like everything that happened in the Old Testament is bad. That's part of the reason why I hate the whole concept of, like, scriptural inspiration. Because
Yeah,
it makes it this
yeah,
it
yeah.
makes it this binary conversation where, like, you have people like I grew up with being like, "Every single word, not one jot nor tittle shall fit," is directly from the mouth of God, which is this extreme claim. Um,
Well, it's
and so
it's
then
also
people
kind of like, what do you think was happening when human beings put pen to paper?
it's almost like they believe
Right.
that it was almost like a fugue state or something, honestly.
Yeah, like they went into like a trance and like the Holy Spirit
Essentially,
took over
yeah.
and was just like,
We never really talked about the mechanics of it much, but to the little extent that we did, it was something like that. We did think that how now people will do something called like automatic writing, where they'll enter a trance state supposedly and like sit there and just start writing stuff, and it's supposed. Yeah, I don't know if it's ever been verified. It very likely isn't, but it also might be. I genuinely don't know. But the idea that you can sort of enter a trance state and then start writing, and essentially after a minute, your subconscious is essentially writing. You're not consciously writing words. Um, that's almost the idea that we had, or I think I even saw imagery like paintings where it would be like someone sitting there like writing, like one of the apostles or somebody writing, and then you'd see like Jesus or something behind him, sort of like embracing him from behind with his hand on the writer's hand, moving it.
right. Yeah, it's just interesting, like because for me, I take a very kind of like naturalistic,
Mm.
anthropological interpretation of the history of religion. Um, but I'm a panentheist, so I don't see those two things as being like in opposition with
No,
one another. Like,
no, they're not
but
like mutually
if you,
exclusive. No, at all.
yeah, but if you do think that human activity and God's activity are somehow opposed, then you don't really have a way of actually accounting for how the scriptures arose in the first place.
It's incredibly, we're talking from the philosophical standpoint, like it's incredibly dualist. You know,
Yes, yeah, yeah,
like you have the
yeah,
spirit and then you have the flesh. You
yes,
know, and
yeah, yeah,
people are bound up in like that people have a nugget of spirit inside of them, but it's been tainted essentially by sin. And they are bound to the flesh, and the flesh is constantly trying to overtake the spirit. And God is spirit, and he's able to essentially purify, but it is but it's not something I realized at the time. But like if you were going to look back and say, "Oh, philosophically, how did you grow up?" I grew up like a hardcore dualist, you
yeah.
know.
But ironically, that idea is most associated with Gnostics. The idea that like the fleshy stuff is like the evil stuff because it was created by the demiurge, but
Yeah.
then like spiritual stuff is like the good, like light.
That's the
Oh,
real the real thing, like,
yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's very strange. It's very
it's so
strange.
fascinating, it's so
Um,
fascinating, like, and this is why, honestly, I'm getting more and more interested in going further afield, because I just can't ignore. I'm not gonna say that one of and I used to be one of them, one of these snarky skeptic types can be like, "Well," but, like, I just find it interesting, bro. I find it interesting that you've got, like, the Mayans, and they tell this story about how about how the gods came down and they created the people of corn, but the people of corn were essentially too aware and didn't, like, make very good kind of slaves almost, and so they were like, "Well, back to the drawing board." And then they went back and made us, which was the people of wood. And we are the people of wood because the veil of Maya has been drawn over our eyes, and we are no longer able to see spiritual truth and no longer able to see reality as it really is. Like these fucking themes, just they're even and they exist in philosophy now even, and I'm not saying that there's not a line of connection. It's not like I'm saying they just appear out of the ether randomly, but they just show up over
Yeah.
and over and over in across these different cultures, and while I reject what I was taught that these things meant as a kid, I can't ignore how compelling as a part of, like, the human story these are, and I'm open to the idea that there's I don't know what it would be, but that there's something else, you know, going on here, that we constantly have this theme in our cultures of us having of us feeling like we've been disconnected, you know?
Mhm.
And then you look at psychedelics, and I've talked about that, like, and I've talked to so many other people about it that say the same thing of like, of, and I'm not saying that everyone has this, but of of if you take psychedelics and people will talk about getting that sense of oneness, of like of oneness. My experience of that has always been not one of like, oh, I just discovered this new thing. I, and this is purely experiential, and the skeptical types aren't going to like it, but fuck them, I don't fucking care. The the experience that you have when you awaken to that sense of oneness is not one of discovery, it is one of relief and of, and I'm this it almost makes me want to cry just talking about this, and of one of fucking remembering.
Mm.
It's not some new discovery about the world.
Mm.
And I hear similar things when people talk about near death experiences. Like I said, these things show up over and over and over again. If it's not like, oh wow, it's like, oh, that's right. Oh, it's okay. Oh,
Yeah.
damn it. I've been confused this whole time.
Mm.
There's something to that.
Yeah.
I'm not gonna call it anything because I don't know what the fuck it is. My
Mm.
this comes back to, like, the apophatic idea,
Yeah.
of what
Yeah.
we can say what God is not, we cannot say what it is, you know? I'm not gonna sit here with my fucking chimp sounds and act like I can say what that is. I can tell you what it feels like. I can tell you, like I said, and as per skeptical types, to me, that's your problem. At this point, I'm like, "That's your fucking problem," because 'Cause you've got, like, skeptics, like I said, that where it's like, and this has become a big thing for me because I used to just encapsulate what I'm talking about to things like, what supposed spiritual experience and psychedelics, things like this. But I'm like, I think the principle holds on much more, quote, unquote, "mundane" things. I'm like, love. Just love. Like, I've used this example a few times recently, but I've seen people in, like, the skeptic community where I'm like, "Oh, love," and they're like, the smug bastard thing again, where they're like, "Oh, it's just oxytocin." I'm like, "Dude, you're describing a mechanism." Like like I said the other day, like, first of all, way to tell me you've never actually been in love without telling me you've never been in love.
Yeah.
Like, you are a walking fucking reductio ad absurdum, bro. At some
Yeah.
point,
Well,
you gotta glow up and
yeah.
stop being afraid, dude. That doesn't mean that you abandon the utility of skepticism. Skepticism is important. It can keep us from being misguided by others and even misguided by our own intuitions, which can sometimes lead us astray. I don't wanna make that like, what I learned and what I gathered from my years in skepticism, I'll always carry with me. But increasingly, to quote myself, I said it in a note the other day on Substack where I was like, a lot of people, even in like the science community and definitely in the skeptic community, they built this cage around their mind and they just want to spend all their time just jerking off over like how shiny the bars are. And I'm like, okay, bro, knock yourself out. That's fine. Like I'll continue to keep skepticism in my tool bag, but it's not me.
Yeah. But I mean, I can understand why people who come from fundamentalist backgrounds, like, there's clearly a desire to, like, not kinda, like, fall for that, like, stuff again.
Oh, I won't get
But
fooled again. Yeah.
but I think it becomes, like, unhealthy when you're so afraid of believing the wrong thing that you actually don't then ever find the right thing. Like, you're so afraid of being deceived that you actually never end up seeking truth.
Yeah.
Um, but that's a fear-based reaction, and it's an understandable one,
Understandable.
especially
Totally. I was there. I mean, that was me for a long time. So I'm not. I'm kind of giving him shit, but a lot of that shit is directed at myself because I was that smug bastard for a while. You know,
Yeah.
I was that. Even recently, I said, doubting Thomas was my favorite disciple. Um, you know,
Yeah.
and so if anybody follows my stuff at all, like this is a theme. I'm typically not like binary on something. So like, no, I'm not going to say, oh, skepticism is stupid. No, any more than now I will say, oh, Christianity is stupid. No, like there's good things at it. There's good tools you can have in it, and if it's misapplied, it can lead to disastrous results. This is literally almost everything that we fucking do as human beings. There are very
Yeah.
few systems of thought that are like unmitigated goods. If you take
Yeah.
most ideas to like an extreme in which you do not compare them against their environment, you will just get lost. Which, to talk about the Bible thing, I think is one of the reasons why a lot of the messaging there is not, "Oh, don't ever do this." It's, even if you look at some of the writings of Paul, it's like, "Don't come under the power of things," you know? And to
Yeah.
take it more
Yeah.
broadly afield, I feel that way about just ideology in general, Like, and that's where skepticism is incredibly valuable because it's like, don't just copy paste some whole viewpoint into your brain.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
at that point, and the fact is, if you do that, there's probably a couple things in that viewpoint that you're probably right about. And then once again, you're probably going to sit there and beat off over about how right you fucking are. But like Jesus Christ, the world is not it is that simple and it isn't that simple. But like
Mm.
I say the same thing now. Like you'll hear you in the new atheist circles, you would hear, and it's snarky, but it is true, where it's like, oh, you're born in America, which happens to be Christian, which, oh my God, it just so happens to be the only right way of believing. How lucky are you that you just so happen to land in the one group of people that's right about everything? You know, like,
Yeah.
and, but the thing is, like, you apply that to anything. Like, oh my God, you were born on the coast of California and you just so happen to be a flaming liberal. Oh, how lucky
Yeah.
for you that you just happen to have all the right fucking opinions about reality. Oh my
You just
God, you were
happen
born
to
in
believe in liberal democracies
yeah.
and
And, oh my God, you were
republic.
born in you were born in Kentucky, and you just so happen to love, oh, how grateful for you that you just so happen to be right about all your conservative viewpoints. Like, are you a fucking child? To anyone who's like
Yeah.
completely ideological, like, and this is where I get passionate, but I'm like, grow the fuck up. Look at what we're dealing with here. Do you honestly think that all of this crap is a result of not enough fucking ideology?
Yeah.
Like, you look at like, and Nietzsche's got a host of his own issues, but like increasingly, um, and just invoking him here can bring up a shitstorm. But fuck it, anyone who actually knows some of this stuff will get what I'm saying. He had this idea of like, um, of the, well, eventually people called it the Ubermensch, which obviously brings up a whole, a whole host of problems. But if you actually like look at a lot of what he was talking about, he was essentially, and I don't even agree with a lot of the archetype he was creating now, but sort of this idea of like, bro, this other shit's not working. Like, we need a new paradigm. We need a new paradigm of people that are willing to, like, engage with the world in good faith and in humility, primarily epistemic humility, from a place of compassion, but that also don't tolerate bullshit.
Mm.
Like, this is a thing that we can do,
Yeah.
of stopping trying to make everything about our identity, about so I can make sure everyone else knows what I'm about. You aren't about anything other than what you fucking do. Sorry, very passionate.
No, no, no. It's good. It's good. So how? Because we've had so many conversations, and it's like I think you've expressed the fact that you appreciate like what I'm doing in terms of trying to um kind of build a vision of Christianity that's more positive, especially than the kind of the ways that you've been damaged by terrible ideas and me to a much lesser extent, but still to some extent. you know, been damaged by traditionalism. Like what? How do you think we as or like Christianity as a religious movement, how do you think we can avoid like fundamentalism, basically? Like what are some of the like good antidotes to like this like mindset?
It's difficult because I have like inclinations that are, I guess you'd say, sort of like Jeffersonian, in that I, in terms of it being used as an actual religion, I understand. Like as people can tell, all these things always have. There's always different facets to talk about. The Bible is a book as part of the human story, and even the horrible bits in there, like from my perspective as a non-religious person, I don't have any issue with the Bible because it's a book. I have an issue with what people do with it, with what they think it says. And so from like sort of an anthropologic perspective, I don't have any issue with the Bible in principle any more than I have an issue with any other book. They're books. It's shit people said. Like it doesn't have a valence to me. I am troubled, and this doesn't just apply to Christianity. If I'm to look at it through the lens of, and this is not practical either because I just don't think it's going to happen, which is why I don't really seriously propose it. I think there's shit in there that as far as say that maybe you would say like because there are different versions of the Bible, I'd love to see whole parts of it just go by the wayside. Like in the same way that you have like books that in mainstream Christianity are called like pseudepigraphal books, like the Book of Enoch, things like this, where it's like, oh, this is like I would love to see this is perfect world won't happen, but I would love to see the canon of Scripture revised where big hunks of it are just taken out because um as long as they're there, because human beings are how they are, as long as they're there, there's going to be a type of person that is going to come along and is going to use them in order to empower atrocity. I just don't see a way around that. Um, that's what I would like to see happen. Um, but from a realist standpoint, um, probably not happening. Um, so in that case, I think I think that people doing the kind of work that you are doing, and that's part of why I support your view of not only Christianity but even God. That's why I support it so much because where 5 years ago I was very new atheist, where I was like, religion's bullshit. Like we just got to get rid of it. We got to get rid of it. You um, I think my first article on Substack was modern spirituality, which was essentially, and of course, as it was is with all these things, it satisfied precisely no one, um, because religious people felt it took too much away from them, and atheists felt it made too many concessions to religion. Um, but I'm not here to make people fucking happy. Um, and it's been a theme in my stuff because I did that piece, the new creed, which also pleased precisely precisely no one. Um,
I'm very familiar with that feeling.
yeah, yeah, no, yeah, and that's where we have like an accord. You know what I mean? Is um, you're a theist, and so and you're kind of recently reconverted, so all of your sort of previous probably like kind of atheist crowd is like, bro, what the fuck are you doing? You lost your mind. But then with how you think about God and Christianity and such, you're constantly going to get shit from people who think that you're like, oh, you're tainting it and you're liberalizing it and all this other kind of thing. You know.
Yeah.
Um. So the fact is, if you follow your conscience and if you follow the rabbit, people are going to come and go. You know, you just have to price. If you truly believe in something, you just got to price that in at the start. I'm going here. If you want to come along for the ride, and you know what, my goal might shift too. That's the other thing. It's like I'm going here, but if I decide the goal's in, well, then I'm going to shift. So you might be the one that shifts. You know, um, but so long as you're following your conscience, and you're treating people with compassion. I mean, that's the important thing. And as far as for Christianity, it's like I think, and you're not the only one. See, that's the thing is I see. I feel like there is a growing interest from people to look at Christianity. I don't think it's huge in the way that some of the, forgive the phrase, but on like YouTube and what I call like Christ slop, which is all of this, it's like with the Alex O'Connor thing where they're like going around and like taking things that atheists say out of context and then being like, "Oh, look, he's so close to the,"
Oh,
like,
yeah, yeah.
yeah,
Oh,
that's what I mean by Christ slop. Um,
it's this whole, it's like content farming.
yes,
Yeah,
but
it's
it's
oh, it's
extra,
horrible, isn't it?
e even as a former Christian, like, it's extra gross to me because of what it's done in service of. 'Cause that happens a lot now, where it's like, obviously, I don't like it because of my views now, but even when I was hardcore in, I still would not have approved of it.
Mm,
I've been like, "This is," even then, I would have still been like, "This is bullshit," you know?
mm.
It's like this thing I wrote the other day where I was um, like, "Stop trying to make Christianity cool. It was never supposed to be cool." You know what I mean? Like,
Mm.
Jesus said, "Take up your cross and follow me." That's not fucking cool. He said it is easier for a rich man to fit through the eye of a needle. And I'm gonna go on record as this as well. If somebody can find me an original source, I would genuinely love to see it. But I'm really tired of every time I talk about the easier than a rich man to go in the eye of a needle, some some person being like, "Well, actually, there was a small door in that time where you could fit a camel through after dark." And, so he wasn't saying it was that really impossible. He was saying it was really hard. I have never found an original historical source that says that there was a small door that you could like beat your camel through. I'm
No, I never.
convinced. I'm convinced that that's some bullshit that some pastor came up with somewhere to try to like lure in rich people to donate money to the church.
Yeah,
I don't know
probably.
that. I don't know that, but to me, I'm like, come on, like, no. He said, okay, put aside the rich man through the eye. What did he tell that guy to do? He
It's all
said, go home, sell all your shit,
yeah.
and come and follow me. Tell me what's now. Actually, ironically, I think that's badass. I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
That's not cool.
That's pretty
That's not.
base, man.
Yeah, that's not like Crispo Dollar. God wants you to, Joel Osteen, get me another fucking Bentley.
Yep.
That's blasphemy to me, and I don't even believe in blasphemy anymore,
Yeah.
you know? So, Jesus was about service and sacrifice. So that would be my thing for Christians. Like, look at your name. That
Yeah.
doesn't mean that none of the other stuff is relevant and you can't take inspiration from that, but it's in your fucking name. It's what I said, and that's not to say either that I like agree with everything Jesus said, but in terms of just looking about what the guy was about, maybe start there. I don't want y'all to start wearing the WWJD bracelets again, but once again, to shamelessly quote myself, I think it was in the Christless Christianity article, I was like, I, I don't wish to see the admittedly like cringe WWJD bracelets come back, but at least that would like give me an idea that Christians at least give some sort of a fuck about how their professed savior would potentially behave.
Mm.
And so that's my thing. Like, reconnect with Jesus. You say he's your Lord and Savior. Why don't you focus on that? Stop viewing it as your whole identity and your culture and literally re-engage with like what would Jesus do?
Well, do
Because
you
that's the
think
thing.
that, like, do you think that may be the kind of soteriology of some of these groups, which is basically like a really bastardized version of sola fide, like
Mm,
this emphasis on it's basically it's about believing the right things or like
yeah,
saying the right
yeah,
things.
hmm,
Um,
yeah,
and actually, what you do has no real consequence in the end. Um,
You're supposed to
like,
do good works, but it's sort of to like show people that you're, you know what I mean?
okay, so we do good work to like show off to other people. Great.
Yeah,
Like, I think that that is at the root of a lot of these issues because
yeah,
actually, for a lot of people, trying to be more Christ-like isn't really on their agenda. It's
no.
about believing the right things and convincing other people to also believe the right things.
Believing the right things about Jesus,
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
not
Um,
manifesting Christ and his love in the fibers of your fucking being. Because to me,
yeah.
that should be what faith is. Like if you're gonna have faith, you are living your faith. Faith
Yeah.
is
Well.
not an opinion. It is bound up in what you do and in who you
Yeah.
are.
Well. Yeah. I completely agree. Like, what would it mean, or what does it mean to let Christ into your heart if that is just like a thing you say rather than something that has a an effect on the kind of like the way you live and is
Yeah.
actually
And even
a
that
way of
phrasing was
orienting
sorry.
yourself. No, go
Like
on.
even that phrasing was very mechanistic, and it was never really specified to me what that meant. Like literally, maybe, and this was partly me just being a dumb kid, but it was literally like, "Oh, ask Jesus into your heart." And then they literally would use this analogy where they would say that other people had an empty space in their heart. And so I took that to mean that there was literally a Christ-shaped hole in people's hearts, and that people who were like Buddhists were trying to fill that with like Buddha, but they couldn't get it in there because he was too fat. Um, and I'm not now that was me being a dumb kid. I'm not saying that
Oh,
that's
yeah.
how they conceive of it. That's not saying, but that was something that, like, made sense to me as a kid based on how it was presented to me,
Mm.
because the idea of Jesus, and don't get me wrong, a lot of people in those circles would be like, "No, we think you should be manifesting Christ in your life." Okay, cool. Cool story, bro. Um, like, even the Christ coming into your heart thing, it was always framed in this sort of very mechanistic sense, where it wasn't now that, like, "Oh, you are, like, suffused with the love of Christ, and that this should just be, completely what you're about." Like, that might be kind of said abstractly sometimes, but it was that idea of, like, you're born a flawed and fallen human being with this empty hole in you, and if you don't fill the hole with Jesus, it's like filling a cup, you know? Um, like, make sure the cup is full, and then if things are going really well, then maybe my cup runneth over, but it was all very mechanistic, and
It's
once
also
again,
very individualistic and like selfish. It's kind of like everything is about
incredibly.
what you can do for me rather
Oh, the
than
whole
what I
thing
can
is
do for other people.
massively egotist like, that was another big unpick for me that happened, was realizing I was like, "Holy shit, like, this entire thing is an exercise of ego."
Mm.
Of, like, I'm God's chosen, and Jesus wanted to save me, me through his, and I've chosen to accept it, and like, it's so, once again, now I actually like, in other contexts, I like the character of Lucifer, but, like, the irony is that the way that many, many Christians live is by their own standards almost Luciferian, where "I will be like the Most High." Like, they will never admit it. They'll go to their graves denying that they do it, but "By their fruits ye shall know them, and your fruits fucking stink."
They're moldy fruit, man. It's
Yep.
moldy fruit. Yeah. It's and like what do you think? I mean, there's been some recent conversation about it on Substack, and I've written about it before. We'll probably write it about it again. But for those who don't know, I'm a universalist, um, which essentially means I think every person will ultimately be saved.
Mhm.
And I
And
have
there's
quite a
scriptural support for that too. What is God's will, that none should be lost, but that all should come to. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and so I think I mean, we're talking about like wish list of things to improve Christianity. Like
Mm,
something that's on my wish list is to wave goodbye to the any doctrine of eternal conscious torment, however that's
mm,
expressed, because it's expressed different
yeah.
denominations and different theological streams. And some are worse than others. It's very easy to pick the worst version and to be like, "Oh yeah, hell was the stupidest idea ever." But you, you know, there are some more sophisticated explications of the doctrine, but I just think ultimately they all fail. And ultimately they're still pretty morally abhorrent. Um, like, what do you think, especially within the context of like, you literally believe that everyone who wasn't in your particular sect was going to hell?
Mm.
Like, what kind of damage does that do spiritually, and how does it affect your relationship with other people?
Um, now, I don't. I mean, I, 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 I think, it contributes to this alienation. When you're in it, it leads to, it just naturally leads to even in that context would be the sin of. I mean, it should be within that context, like kind of gratitude, but it often leads to this sin of pride
Mm.
because it's like, here I am out in the world, like, oh, I've got a secret, like, I've got a catapult, like, um, of this thing of like, oh, look at all these poor bastards, the lost and damned, going in, and I've got the way, and uh, but it leads to, yeah, it leads to this sort of this otherizing where like whenever you're out in the world, you're like, I'm not like these people, you know. It cuts you off from the rest of humanity. You don't you We didn't see other people as like fellow human beings. It's fundamentally anti-humanistic.
Yeah.
All of you are flawed and damned. We were too, but we're special. So everything that you're trying to do and you're about is against what God wants. And we were also incredibly, like, the delusions of persecution were insane. Like, anything that was literally just secular culture trying to be like, "Hey, you guys have been steamrolling us for the last 200 years. Maybe we can, like, open it up and actually try to enforce this, freedom of religion thing." Any move in that direction was like, "Oh, deep down, they're all working for the devil, and they know our truth, and they're trying to, like, counter our truth." Like, I don't know if this is ever verbalized, but I still encounter it, and I try not to. I get passionate. I try not to get angry, but it is something I still, even in other contexts, I've noticed it sends me 0 to furious. Is anytime someone is essentially trying to like tell me that I know something that I don't know. When someone's like, uh, "You now, deep down that no, don't fucking tell me what I know." You know,
Yeah.
like they do this thing where they interact with the rest of the world like deep down because they use verses, and this is what they also use as God's excuse for being able to condemn people to hell. Um, because um, and this is a very problematic, uh, but this is what it was called. We were told how to deal with what was called the Hottentot argument,
Please
which
tell.
was in which was in reference to the idea that because Hottentots was a phrase for uh, some tribe, I think in either I can't even remember now, say Africa or South America or something that like supposedly in this context like would never have heard of Jesus.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And so the Hottentot argument was, what about what about, groups like the Hottentots um that like never even heard of Jesus, you know, and then we would use the verse that said they have evidence of God in nature and are therefore without excuse. Um which is once again completely incoherent because it's like, oh, so that means that God gave them just enough information to damn them but didn't give them the way out. How is
Yeah.
that in any way just? Because at least for the Old Testament and stuff, it was like, okay, well, because that was another question was like, oh, well, Abraham, like, is Abraham in heaven? And it was like, well, yeah, Abraham's in heaven. Well, how is he in heaven? He didn't know anything about Jesus. Well, that was under a different dispensation, and once Jesus showed up, the rules changed, you know. Um, so they had an answer for that. But yeah, the otherizing is so deeply fucking baked into how they think about everything. I mean, we
Yeah.
thought black people were a result of Ham uh getting shunted down. Like we thought that Shem was essentially what led to Jews, and I think maybe Asians. I don't even remember. And we thought that white people, essentially like us, were like of the line of Japheth, and we thought that Ham. This is horrible. I'm just recounting. I'm just passing it along. We thought that Ham had been shunted down, um, and that um essentially black people were children of Ham, and that their whole thing, including slavery, was essentially part of the sort of the punishment of God for the fact that Ham walked in and saw Noah naked, um, because the sins of the father will be visited upon the son up into the however many generations. And that was also the excuse for why it was totally okay for the Israelites, I think, to have, like, the little kerfuffle with the Amalekites and then to encounter them again. The whole William Lane Craig thing. That whole argument about, "Well, by my theology, all those brutally murdered children went directly to heaven, and so that's okay." And this is what I'm saying, to come full circle. Like, if that stuff isn't gonna be taken out, it and this is what I've used sort of people like you as being a part of. And as you so, I think, brilliantly said in one of your articles about people resisting sort of faith evolving, it's never stopped. It's been happening. Like even something like the dispensational thing. Like, okay, I can accept that these things aren't going to be taken out of there, but there needs to be something sort of maybe on the doctrinal level, even if it isn't totally agreed on, because of course it's humans and nothing will ever be totally agreed on.
Yeah, of course.
But
Yeah.
like most Christians don't follow, like they're not, unless they're Seventh Day Adventists or something like that. Like most Christians don't follow Levitical law because they've restructured things where, for one reason or another, they don't agree, all of them, on why this is the case, but they don't feel they need to follow it anymore. And you could say that, like, oh well, most of them have already done something like that with homosexuality and all, which is good. But my point would be, keep going,
Yeah.
like keep going, like, and I would say I would love to see. And once again, I feel like you're fine about it, and there are other Christians that are fine about it, but there needs to be more bravery. And I know this is a big ask because people like the type that I came from, and then ones that are way worse, like the Christian nationalists and the Fed and the Westboro Baptists, they're scary motherfuckers because they're crazy and they have guns. So I know this is a big ask, but I'm going to be a slightly uncharitable. Jesus said, "Take up your cross and follow me." And that also includes resisting the bad parts within your own faith. So I understand it's easy for me to say because I'm out. It's not my battle to fight, I don't think. I do fight it, but I'm not at it all the time. But Christians, you have a stake in this thing. This is supposedly something that you believe, and you have these other bastards out here that are just embodying the absolute worst possible version of it. I know they're scary, but Jesus said, "Take up your cross and follow him." It's time to put your fucking big boy pants on and start. And I'm not saying that many of you aren't. That's not what I'm saying. But it needs, and quite frankly, this needs to happen in all like the monotheistic things.
Yeah.
There
Yeah.
needs to be a more vocal movement of saying, yeah, no, what you're doing is wrong. It's happening. It needs to happen more.
Yeah.
I know it's scary. I know it's scary. I'm scared of them too. Like I'm totally fine with this, you putting this on YouTube. There's a chance somebody from my past life might see this.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not outside the box of these things causing difficulties for me, but these people need to be stopped,
Yeah.
you know? And to speak as far as for you, now I'll speak to the atheist. Regardless of what type of sort of fundamentalism it is, fundamentalism potentially poses if you are sort of a liberal-minded atheist who believes in sort of humanism and the human project, fundamentalism of any type is an existential risk to everything that we care about. I have deep religious wounds. I understand. I understand how much it hurts you to think about maybe reaching across the aisle to someone who maybe is religious, but who cares about fundamentally the same things that you do. To say, hey, we don't agree on a lot, but we care about at root, we care about the same things. We care about compassion. We care about human flourishing. We care about the freedom to seek truth. We care about these core principles. I know it hurts you. It still bothers me a little bit sometimes. But many of us atheists, we like to think, well, we just care about the facts and we're so practical and shit. All right. For us, put your money where your fucking mouth is. Even if you've got to contextualize it as the enemy of my enemy is my friend, atheist, put your big boy pants on. Stop fapping to all. I love the new atheists. Same with the skeptic thing. They had a huge impact and important role for my life. But stop beating off to do atheist content. Wake up and start being willing to collaborate with people who actually care about the things you care about, regardless of what they look like. I'm trying to do that. I'm here talking with you today about you as a Christian. It was 2 days ago. I talked to Satanic Fragment. You know why? Because at root, he cares about the same things I care about. I don't give a
Yeah, and
fuck
I mean,
what.
I watched that conversation and I nodded my head along to a lot of what he was saying. Some of it not
Yeah.
so much, but yeah.
Well, yeah. That's what I'm saying. And that's the thing. We are going to disagree. There are going to be things that we just maybe never will see eye to eye on. But if someone shares your like first principles and you're disagree, okay, I'll put it this way. You have to be able to put aside the smaller stuff and link up to people who share your first principles. It is very likely that how you apply those first principles in your life will look quite different, and there will probably be disagreements there. But there are tons of people in this world who do not share your first principles. They don't give a fuck about compassion. They are willing to viralize what they think the world should be through the use of violence. And if we are not willing to put aside the petty differences in application of our first principles in order to resist those who are willing to commit violence to create the world in their own fucked up image, we will be maybe it won't be this year. I'm not trying to be an alarmist. Maybe it won't be in 10 years. But if we are not willing to set aside the dumb shit in order to come together with those who we maybe on the surface don't look the same as, but who share our same ideals, we will be destroyed.
Yeah. No, I completely agree with everything you're saying, and I think you and I are a good example. I mean, there's nothing special about you and I, but we uh, we disagree about so much when it comes
We do.
to religion. But I mean, we also agree on a lot, but we share the same fundamental core principles, and I have way more in common with you than I do with other people who bear the name Christian, but then, you know, do just do and say abhorrent things. And I think we do need people like you, people in the atheist community, and even the new atheists to an extent, although they were problematic for different reasons. But we need people like you who are willing to throw stones from the outside and say, like, guys, you need to clean up your house. But we also need people on the inside who are willing to stand up and fight for better visions of religion. You know, like I posted or restacked someone who posted a note on Substack talking about there was a Greek Orthodox bishop who said that um, he said online, the clip went viral, like that basically children are gay because their parents had anal sex.
What the?
And I only know of one other bishop in the Orthodox Church who stood up and said, "This is nonsense and abhorrent." Um,
It's
and
hard. I mean,
yeah, I
hard to
mean,
do. I don't want to. I don't want to diminish that. It is very hard to do. But
and
Jesus,
this person still, this person is still, a bishop in Greece. Like, they're
yeah,
still
there weren't any
operating.
consequences to them for saying that shit. Yeah.
No, they're a bishop in good standing with the church, and so the part. I mean, I'm not trying to shit on the Orthodox Church. There's so much to love there, and there's so much beauty, and there's so much good. But one of the reasons I left is because we can't. In a lot of quarters, you can't even have those types of
No.
conversations, and I think
Yeah.
that's a massive problem. And I think if I had not left, I would have basically been forced out for expressing some of these opinions,
Yes.
or at least, you know, my position as a member of the church in good standing would have been questioned.
Yeah.
Um, and
And going
so,
back to the cult thing, that's a huge part of it. Of I don't so much care. Well, are you an actual cult or I don't care. If you're in an organization and broadly put, I don't talk about politics much, but obviously we're seeing this in a huge level in the US right now. I don't care what the organization is. Once again, I always try to look at like sort of the principle of these things. If you're part of some group where you are not able to safely criticize the authority figures, something's seriously fucking wrong. You need to change the group or you need to get out. There's no reason for that. I'm sorry. Every single one of these fucks, whether it's President Dinklefuck or Bishop
yeah,
whatever the hell, they're all meat. They're all meat and potato monkey humans like you and me, and they all take ugly shits and have zits and all this other bullshit just the same way that you and I do. There's no one in any position that is above criticism. And if you're in an organization where it's like, oh no, Steve Rainier with Nexium said that we can't fuck Steve.
yeah, and it's especially
Fuck.
problematic when Christian principles like forgiveness are like invoked
Yes.
to like further to like hide and cover up
Yep.
and further abuses that happen within religious organizations.
Yes.
Um,
I think that's what Nietzsche was talking about, and I don't agree with it. He took a lot of things much farther than I would, but I think that's what he was driving at when he said sort of like the, again quoting, slave morality idea, and his idea of Christianity as a slave morality, of this idea of like, you know, I don't take it to the opposite extreme where I'm like, no, punch him in the, like there can be a time for that, but this idea of like you are beholden to put up with shit, you are beholden to turn the other cheek. Oh, you were just horribly victimized by something. Oh, you must learn to forgive them. Fuck that. That doesn't mean like once again, it's this stupid binary. I made a post about it earlier today. Like I'm increasingly thinking that something like something like radical acceptance is probably a good ultimate goal. But that doesn't entail that you have to have nice feces for you know. Now if
but
you
also,
get
I read your note about radical acceptance and thought that that was much closer to what Christ was trying to get at with the whole forgiveness thing
yeah,
than we have to
this
basically
weaponized
we have to like let people off for doing horrific things and
no,
they don't face any consequences.
exactly. Like I think that's a bastardization of the idea. And
Yes. Yeah.
for me, where I came from, that was sort of what forgiveness was. But I understand when people say that, like, oh, like what you're saying, essentially, like that, like, oh, well, actual forgiveness is something closer to wrath. Then that's once again, that's totally fine. Like, if that's how it's being used, that's fine. But the idea, and if somebody has that as a stretch goal for themselves, where they're like, hey, I was horribly victim. I'm not. Once again, I'm about autonomy. I'm not gonna tell somebody what to fucking do. Like, if you were horribly hurt by someone, and as part of your journey and dealing with that, at some point you reach the point where you're like, you know what, I'm gonna actually flip it and I'm going to have compassion for that person. That's that's crazy. Like, that's incredible. And you could even say that maybe that is like something Christ-like of so but but the idea that some other person will look at someone that was horribly victimized and immediately be like, "Oh, well, you need to do the work now. You need to love them and forgive them." Fuck that. Like,
It's victim
you can
blaming.
yeah, essentially.
It's
Yeah,
victim blaming.
it's under a different but yeah, it's essentially like even if you're not saying it was your fault, you're now putting the responsibility on that person.
Yeah.
And it's like you can just negate people. I think that's totally fine. If someone's deeply, deeply hurt you, you don't have to I'm not gonna say go fuck them up, you know? But one, I probably wouldn't judge you if you did, but I mean that's neither here nor there. But it's like you can look at someone and be like, "Fuck you, you don't get to be in my life anymore." But I'm not going to let my life be ruled by what you did to me,
Yeah.
you know? You don't have to love the person. Like and to like I said, if someone wants to do that, that's their prerogative. But the idea that we're in a position to tell people to do that to me is obscene. Like,
I completely agree. I completely agree. So to start kind of wrapping up here, I, I, I mean, I really appreciate your openness and your candidness and your passion that you've expressed in this conversation. I think it's been great, and I think it's really important that people who are Christians and who are defenders of Christianity and who think there's a lot of good in Christianity, like we need to be able to look at our own mess, and we need to be able to clean up our own house. And I think having conversations like this, like I know even within myself that like I need to be reminded sometimes that there are expressions of Christianity which are deeply toxic, deeply damaging, like morally abhorrent. Like just because this is a thing I love doesn't mean that I need to go super far in trying to defend it against, you know, some of these kind of accusations. Because there are versions of Christianity which, you know, which are like this, which live up to the straw men, which live up to the caricatures. Um,
somewhere, yeah.
yeah. But I think maybe to the last bit I would ask you to do, is to anyone who might be watching, who is in a situation that is similar to the situation you are in, finds themselves in a fundamentalist Christian sect and who, you know, wants something different. W- is there any advice you could give them?
Um, if you're actually, like, physically it's tough. Um, if someone is physically stuck because of their age or something like that, where they literally can't get out, it's 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 very difficult. On that front, it's tough to say without knowing people's whole situation. I would say sort of ironically, kind of like keep the faith and look for look for a way out and just know that there are people waiting, there are organizations even that you can try to reach out to try to help you, especially if you're in a situation that's like, um, essentially like a cult. Um, there are, look into the work of someone like Dr. Stephen Hassan, um, who's his entire, career essentially. He used to be a member of the Moonies, and he heavily deals with, um cults, essentially like resources for people who have gotten out of cults, potential resources for interventions. Like there are resources out there if you are stuck in one of these things and feel like you can't get out. Be careful because once again, depending on your situation, yes, be very careful. Um, as far as if someone either just got either just got out or um is thinking of getting out or is doing sort of the they're sort of their body's in, but they've already left type of a thing. Um, I think if I had to give some bit of advice that's very personal, kind of uniquely from me, it would be have patience for yourself because you have you've been done a wrong, and that wrong is not insignificant. And when you so desperately want to get clear of a thing, um, you're probably going to make some mistakes, and you're probably going to run into a lot of frustration. You're probably going to be trying to reorient yourself in the world. It's going to be very difficult because you were not given the proper tool set. And if you do come from an organization like me where you are really bound up in all of this sort of self-loathing and of like nothing I do is good enough, nothing I do is good enough, it's going to feel like you're just sort of moving from one failure into another. And that is incredibly disheartening. And also just know, which I said kind of like with the missing it thing, that like regardless of circumstance, what you're doing is incredibly difficult because you are leaving a world in which everything is structured for you. You've had your behavior handed to you. You've had your meaning handed to you. You know, you've had your position in life, your role. You've had all of this handed to you. And first of all, what you're doing and separating from that is incredibly brave, incredibly brave. And I'm not a big pride person, but you should be proud of that. Um, but you should know that it's going to be very hard because, and I'm not trying to like plug my own stuff, but like, well, I guess I am, but because genuinely because I think it would be helpful. Like I have that piece, 8 tips for the newly faithless. Because my expectations for what I would find when I left the faith did not match reality at all. The behaviors that you found so bothersome and that drove you out of your faith, you are going to find them out in the world as well, all over the place, just in different ways. Um, and the biggest thing is going to be that you are used to your whole life. You are used to having a reason for existing and to knowing your place in the world. And now you don't have that. Um, be patient with yourself, but also be very careful because there are endless other sources of um, organizations and things out here that are waiting like piranhas to gobble your ass up because they see that you are lost. If you look at the cult thing, like the full blown cult thing, tons of people that end up in cults um, are ex religious people. And they're also people that have recently had, even if it wasn't that, they recently had some sort of a really bad thing happen in their life that's left them adrift. Because it's something that Dr. Stephen Hassan says. He says, no one joins a cult. Like, obviously they do, but no one joins a cult. And from the outside, as far as for other people who aren't experienced in this world, you look and these things and you're like, look at these idiots. I would never fall for one of these things. No, you wouldn't right now. But here's something like what'll happen, and it can happen to people when they come out of religion. Like I said, there's other groups you do not want to come out of the frying pan into the fire. Say maybe you left your religion, or maybe your mom just died, or your partner just left you, or something happened, and you are just out out to the wind. You don't know how to orient yourself. You're not going to have somebody at work that comes up to you and says, "Oh, hey, Steve, come join my cult." You know, they're gonna come over and be like, you're gonna well, first of all, you're gonna see him at work initially. They're gonna seem all like full of life and everything. They're gonna be like, oh, they're really excited and they're talking about stuff. Um, be like, damn, what's going on with Bob? So maybe one day you're sitting at lunch with Bob and maybe you say to Bob about, man, I just went through this thing. That's really hard. Bob's gonna say something to you like, bro, I just joined this business organization and dude, the guy who runs it, man, he's amazing. Talking to him, he's just recontextualized everything for me, man. He's totally changed my life. Um, you need to come to me. You come with me this weekend, man. We're having a seminar, we're having a seminar and he's gonna talk about a lot of the things that you're struggling with, you know. Man, he would love you. You have to meet him. And Steve's kind of be like, no, I don't really go in for that kind of thing. Okay. Week goes by. There you are again. You know, you're having lunch with Bob. Bob's doing great. You know, he's like, man, I'm still going to the meetings and everything, man. I've moved up a level. It's fantastic, man. I'm telling you, you got to come meet the guy who leads this organization. Oh, what is this? What is this thing, man? I don't know. It sounds no, man. It's not a cult. It's a business organization. What are you talking about? We're just exchanging ideas, exchanging business tips. But man, you know, Adam, the guy who leads this, he's the most amazing person I've ever met, man. He's got these insights, Just come, man. Just come to one meeting. And then 4 years later, you know, Adam's banging your girlfriend because he's the only one in the group that's allowed to have sex with anyone. And, and at no point along the line was the person like, "Well, I'm gonna join this cult because 'cause I'm stupid." How do you think people end up in Scientology? How do you think, they end up in any of these things? Scientology is a fucking cult. I'll go out on that one. Scientology is a cult. Fuck Scientology. Um, and they can come haunt me if they want to, whatever, fuck 'em. Um, to be clear though, Scientology does work. It's just the only person it works for is David Miscavige. Um, but so yeah, to sum all that up with my little story and everything, be patient with yourself. Know you're not alone, but be fucking careful because you might not feel like it, but you are incredibly vulnerable. And so probably you actually have a good sense for some of these things. Pay attention to your gut because if you're coming from one of these organizations, you probably saw these kind of behaviors and things before. Trust yourself. Like when it comes to when you're in these kind of new situations for yourself, maybe you are coming out of religion and so you're like, no, I'm going to be super logical. Like, that's great. That's great. You know, embrace reason, all those things. That's all good stuff. But still listen to your gut, you know, still follow your heart and be incredibly careful. And I just it doesn't have to be someone like me, like it's not even my main thing. I write about a lot of stuff. But, if you're someone here on Substack, follow someone like Jim Palmer from deconstructionology. There's numerous people in the deconstruction space. There once again there are whole organizations, like legit organizations that aren't culty in any way, who are there to literally help people just like you.
Maybe we'll find some and then link it down below.
Yeah, we can do that. Yeah, there's definitely a few different ones. So, yeah, that would be it. I tend to drag on, but yeah, know you're not alone. Be very patient with yourself. Have some compassion for yourself, which you've never done before, probably. You've never probably had compassion for yourself. You probably kind of hate yourself. That's something you're going to have to learn to stop doing, but be patient with yourself and be careful. And I will say, if there's somebody hearing this and, they do have a particular question or a struggle or something, you can DM me. That's fine. I don't have my DMs here on Substack. I don't have them like it'll do a request, and I have to approve it. But yeah, if somebody needs to know something, I have no problem helping people. I don't have that like paywall or anything. So yeah, I'm more than happy to help as well.
Yeah. Likewise, likewise.
Yep.
But Ishmael, this has been amazing. Thank you so much. If anyone who's watching this who is not already subscribed to Ishmael on Substack, please go and do so. The link will be in the description. If you're watching live on Substack, please press the little heart button at the bottom right hand corner. It likes the video in advance. That'll be much appreciated. And if you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe. But thank you very much, Ishmael. I think we'll end it there.
Yeah, that was delightful. Thank you, everyone.
Cheers, guys. Bye.